Thank you very much, Congressman. Is everybody feeling welcome? Supposed to welcome you. I have several pages here of things I'm supposed to welcome you with, but I think I've ingested enough to just want to say this. I really appreciate your leadership. And Congressman Delaney, I understand he's going to join us later virtually. Is that right?
Yep.
Or he's here now? Is that what
No, virtually later.
I understand he's going to join us later virtually, and I really appreciate your leadership, your willingness to do this, all of the commissioners. You know, I think sometimes it's so easy to get caught up on the urgent thing of the day and miss the important just altogether. And what could be more important than this topic? What could be more important than the national security, economic security, job security of our entire country and of all Americans? And yet it would be so easy to say 40-year inflation, supply chain woes, you know, war in Europe. We have a lot to deal with. We'll deal with this another day. And because of volunteers like you, we don't have to wait. A lot of people at the chamber can do their day jobs, and we can be thinking about the future. We can be getting smart about the future. So we're so appreciative of the 4 hearings that have happened today, to date. Today's 5th, because we're really thinking it makes us smarter. We can't imagine very many topics as important as this one, right? We're watching what Russia and China are thinking about doing together in this space. Then we're watching Europe decide that, as a European commissioner recently said to me, we're the Silicon Valley of regulation, you know, so we're going to get all the regulation right. The entrepreneurs of regulation here. And, you know, we're watching, instead of building our allies up and what we want to do to compete and confront in this space, we got our allies trying to regulate our industry. And so really thinking about the balance of economic security, national security, but also growth and innovation, but also things that have to be harnessed for good human needs and for us to be good global citizens and parents and grandparents. And so super complex issue, aware of how much you're all doing on it. And we're having a foundation board meeting today in another room where we're talking about all of these issues and what is it we should be incubating and what is it we should be developing. And I was bragging on you all that you're over here traveling the country and really hearing from experts all over the place so that we can, at the end of the day, make policy recommendations that are good for our country, good for our economy, and good for families, right? Which is really where we're trying to get. So I'm going to glance at my notes now and see if there was something else that I was supposed to say. Well, Tom Quadman glares at me. Just reading. I know what I didn't say. I didn't mention the importance of intellectual property, but that's part of what you're doing today, right? That's part of this particular hearing. And so obviously really important to all of our members and to people who are willing to invest in the types of technology and innovation. And so we obviously want to do what we can to protect them. I'm not going to read these stats to you because you would not be here if you didn't know how important this was. But I will say that I just can't imagine a more important topic. We cannot do it without thought leaders like you willing to volunteer your time to do something this important. And you can count on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to do something with this. You can count on us to not just produce a white paper, but to really turn it into action, into work. So I just left one meeting to come over here and to say thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for your leadership at the chamber. When you just went through a bullet point of the challenges facing the world and challenges facing our economy. And I can't think of a more important institution than the Chamber of Commerce to help us to solve some of these challenges. I can say it as a former office holder, you have to rely on outside institutions to provide you good information and leadership and courage. And that's what you're doing here. You have an incredible executive leadership team who this commission has been getting to work with on a regular basis for our previous hearings, but we're delighted to be here at the home base, the headquarters, and particularly appreciative of your leadership and your welcome here today.
I appreciate you saying that. And I'll just say quickly, so 110 years ago, we just had our 110th birthday.
Congratulations.
I don't look good, David.
You don't.
110th birthday, and this building had largely not been touched in a long time. And so thinking about the mostly men who were in this foundation, who were building this building, who were saying business needs a national footprint. We need a place where we can come together and deal with the issues of the day. They had no idea it would be artificial intelligence, right? I mean, they couldn't have imagined that this is what we'd be in this room doing. but they imagined we'd be in this room doing this work to protect America, to protect communities, to protect families. And it's pretty cool that we get to carry on that mantle. Well, I imagine I'm supposed to leave so you can get on with your hearing. Do real work. And I just came in to say thank you. I'm really excited to get to the root of what you're doing. In fact, I don't even know if this is public, but I think we've invited you to present to the chamber board.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's public either, but it's on my calendar.
Having me, and I'm just next to this other meeting. So if you want me to come back, I could welcome you again. If anybody starts to feel unwelcome, I could come back. Thanks so much
Thank you
again. I
very much.
appreciate it.
I'm going to kick things off now. First, I want to thank Suzanne, of course, and the chamber she gave a great sort of recap of the work of this commission so far and a little teeing up of what we're going to be working on today. As Suzanne mentioned, this commission has been hard at work since January. We've been looking to meet with as many people as possible, different organizations and companies, entities to discuss how AI can possibly impact their lives. And while the public testimony portion of our work is starting to conclude, it'll be concluding after today, it's important to highlight how different our work has been. We've heard from top data scientists and students who are just sort of starting their journey within the data scientist field. We've heard from labor unions. We've heard from civil society groups. We've heard from some of the largest corporations on how they recommend addressing artificial intelligence. We've heard from some of our government's most thoughtful leaders on these issues, like Congressman Will Hurd and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Congressman Ro Khanna. And now we as a commission have a really great opportunity to turn the public recommendations into the commission's recommendations, which I think will help drive our country and drive this technology forward and in the right direction. This technology is going somewhere, and we need to make sure we're driving it in the right direction. Before we get to that writing, though, we have one last and very important opportunity today to hear from stakeholders on issues around AI governance, intellectual property, and national security. So our first panel will be on AI governance, and it will allow this commission to hear more about how AI is looking to be governed and how our policymakers should govern it. In the intellectual property panel, we'll get an opportunity to hear from experts on how we can protect America's intellectual property and assure that we can create an environment that allows for continued investment and innovation. And finally, our last two panels today will provide us an opportunity to hear from national security experts who can speak about the importance of this technology and how to ensure that the United States is at the leading edge of its development. It's been an honor to help to lead these hearings with you all. I want to thank the Chamber of Commerce, of course. I want to thank all of the panelists, particularly today. All of our fellow commissioners here who have been working very, very hard. We've been traveling the country and the world, it seems. Actually, we have been. And I want to thank, obviously, my coach here, Representative John Delaney, who will be joining us virtually, as Suzanne mentioned, in a little while, for helping to make this really good discussion. So taking a quick look at the time, we are almost exactly on schedule. And as our commissioners know from our previous 4 hearings, probably my most important job in co-chairing these things is keeping us on schedule. So I get to be the bad guy if folks are overtime. So I'm going to try to keep us on time as much as possible, not just because we want to make sure we're staying on schedule, but because we have specifically a lot of time on our schedule, in our itinerary of the day, to make sure the commissioners, these really, really smart and talented people, get to follow up with you to ask you questions and kind of drill down to some of the things that you're going to talk about in your prepared testimony. So why don't we get started? I'm going to ask you, if you can, to keep your prepared testimony to 7 or 8 minutes. If you hit that point, I'll give you a very gentle reminder to wrap up. And then ideally, that will leave us time to really get into some questions from some of our commissioners as well. So I'm going to go in the order of my piece of paper in front of me. First, we will hear from Brenda Leong, who's a partner at BNH.ai. Brenda, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I am Brenda Leong. BNH.ai is a law firm chartered here in the District of Columbia, where it is unique among law firms in that it was founded by a partnership between a computer scientist and a lawyer. This is the only jurisdiction in the country where that is possible. And it was done with the specific vision of addressing AI and algorithmic challenges with the expertise of both of those fields, since the number one problem in almost any company in governance around their AI and machine learning-based systems is the knowledge, experience, and communications gap between their technical and data scientists and computer scientists and their policy, governance, legal teams, and how to bring those two perspectives and viewpoints together. So that is the work we do, and that informs what I'm going to speak about today. And I'm going to speak fairly fast because I think I was timed for a little bit longer than that. So please cut me off when it's time.
Fair enough.
As a society, we have been dealing with algorithmic decision-making for at least 50 years. We've been doing it imperfectly, but we do have 50 years of precedent in the employment, housing, financial services, and banking industries to provide a solid foundation of strategies and skills for dealing even with these modern challenges. The second point of that is that it has been imperfect, and there is room for improvement, as well as the need to build out those skills to address the specifics of modern machine learning-based systems. Let me walk through this. Based on a public site called the AI Incident Database and other sources, the most common failure modes of AI systems are broken out as follows: security breaches, unauthorized decisions, privacy violations, faulty performance and physical danger, that is safety, algorithmic discrimination, and lack of transparency or accountability. Setting aside the aspects around the physical safety for the moment, these failures correlate largely to 7 identified legal liability areas for AI that all already exist and have legal frameworks built to address them. First is fairness. You might have heard the quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. That is true, but it also means by definition that some models can be biased or inaccurate in harmful ways. Harm tends to focus on already marginalized groups. This can show up in lack of basic access due to the digital divide, or to disability-based access limitations, which are not sufficiently incorporated. Fairness harms are further exacerbated by the combined risk of bias and opacity across high-impact domains: credit and banking, criminal justice, ed tech, employment, fraud detection, healthcare, and real estate. Secondly is the legal liability area of privacy. AI requires data, which is in tension with the tenet of minimalization and makes decisions that implicate a host of privacy laws and regulations. For security, machine learning-based models have complex, evolving attack surfaces that create both traditional and new liabilities, such as model extraction, membership inference, and data poisoning. Transparency. In some cases, there are legal requirements to explain how decisions are being made, but without clear guidance as to what level of explanation is required for what public, auditor, or regulator audience it should be targeted. The concept of agency. Some models are designed to act on behalf of their developers once deployed, and this feature is only going to expand as models, programs, and robots become more sophisticated. Third parties, where data sharing and model development can inject new sources of risk with unclear implications for liability. And traditional negligence, meeting reasonable standards of care in designing and deploying AI models. Too many times, we find that organizations seem to think there are no existing legal standards to meet these challenges. But there are, and for quantitative bias testing for fairness, which is the one that seems to get the most attention, there are plenty of precedents. Existing legal standards vary country to country, state to state, and industry to industry, but do offer many useful tools for exploring standards and measures in the regulatory future. Starting with traditional anti-discrimination law, which can be used as a measure regardless of program or system, AI doesn't start or live in a vacuum. All of our existing laws apply and should be evaluated for use and application for these programs as a level-setting exercise for where we go next. ICRA, ECOA, and Regulation B along with it, and SR 11.7 for model risk management all have important impacts on the systems that function today and impact evaluations of access, transparency, risk controls, and equality. Under civil rights law, in employment and other contexts for protected classes, U.S. law has relatively established rules around evaluations to protect those communities. We know, for example, that disparate treatment is facially unlawful unless or until very narrow exceptions apply, whereas disparate impact creates an extremely useful evaluation of systems without having to directly explore the specific attributes of data set diversity or look directly at model code. This for impact is a substantially different rate of selection and hiring, promotion, or employment decision, which works to the disadvantage of members of a race, sex, or ethnic group. Therefore, when dealing with automated decision-making systems, an informed statistical analysis of model outputs is a first and giant step in identifying potential problems. There are two generally accepted legal measures for such measurement of these systems. The first is the standard for statistical significance. Does a protected attribute correlate to the prediction in a way that is repeatable? Put another way, if I know a predicted attribute like race for a given, protected attribute like race for a given decision, can I predict the decision the model will make? Tests to evaluate this from the field of statistics include the t-test, the chi-square test, the Fisher exact test, and there are others. The second commonly used legal rule to evaluate is for practical significance. The difference between protected attributes, does the difference between protected attributes create meaningful real-world inequalities between groups? More simply, if a model does impact protected groups differently, does the disparity amount to real-world harm? Most courts considering practical significance look to the adverse impact ratio, or AIR, test and align it with the 4/5 rule to determine a legally permissible outcome. Other practical significance tests include percentage point differences, the standardized mean difference, also known as Cohen's d, which measures predicted outcome scores and has equally established thresholds for allowable differences. At BNH, we consider all of these factors and recommend for clients and companies struggling with these systems to build a governance model. Understand that statistical and practical difference testing can be established to reflect existing legal standards outside of their traditional applications. The exact test depends on the type of outcome, whether the information is discrete or continuous, et cetera. To build on that, we can add testing for differential validity, which encompasses some newer testing techniques for bias with less legal precedent, but which are more appropriate for contemporary analytics and which we believe will be more heavily relied on by courts and regulators in the future.
And I'm just going to ask you to wrap up.
Okay. In addition to these existing legal tests, there are different regulatory approaches that offer promise. Model risk management is probably the single other point I want to make today, widely used in the financial sector, which offers the best tools and techniques for dealing with algorithmic decision-making, and again, offers a strong established record of use, trial, and challenge that can be considered when expanding it to broader model contexts and newer industry. Why responsible AI is not working yet? It is too often used as a marketing ploy where ethics and accountability equal marketing claims. Those responsible for implementing governance may lack fundamental resources like budget and staff, which usually correlates to the fact that teams and management have insufficient organizational stature. There's a misalignment of incentives within both companies, the market, and the regulatory sphere. And the tech function usually beats the policy priorities internally, with testers expected to rubber stamp the outcomes. I hope that these thoughts have demonstrated that there is a wealth of existing knowledge, expertise, and legal precedent to leverage, and many reasonable tools available to chart our path forward. Thank you.
And thank you. And thank you for being so kind when I'm being so rude.
Quite all right.
Next on our panel, I'm going to go to Avi Philly. She's the Global Policy Director for Credo AI.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you especially for the perfect pronunciation of my name.
I've been practicing it for a little while.
Thank you to the commissioners. Thank you to the chamber for inviting us here today. My name is Avi, and I'm the Global Policy Director for Credo AI. I'd like to thank also my fellow panelists for already a very thoughtful discussion. Our driving mission at Credo AI is to empower organizations to create AI with the highest ethical standards so that they can deliver responsible AI at scale. But we're still a startup. We were founded just 2 years ago. We are excited to have recently closed our Series A funding round and are proud to be a venture-backed company with Fortune 500 customers from some of the largest cloud providers, financial services enterprises, and defense contractors. Our team includes AI and tech policy experts with experience at companies like Google, Microsoft, IBM, and others. And our CEO, Navrina Singh, was recently chosen to be one of the 27 people appointed to the National AI Advisory Committee to advise the president on the National AI Initiative, alongside many of the experts that will be in the room today. With our in-house expertise at Credo, we've built a software platform that sits on top of a customer's MLOps infrastructure and helps to align both data sets and AI models with responsible AI practices. These include guidelines, industry standards, legislation, and frameworks. With our assessment model, we help our customers produce information sharing artifacts that create transparency throughout an AI model's value chain. You can think of these artifacts as street lamps along a busy street, illuminating specific aspects of the model and the data set throughout its use. Many companies develop a model and want a simple checklist to ensure that their system is not biased before putting it on the market. To Brenda's excellent point earlier, at this point, it's usually too late to align incentives for responsible AI development. Instead, we advocate for responsibility to be cultivated throughout the entire development lifecycle for AI. To encourage this, we've built an open source AI assessment framework called Credo AI Lens, which data scientists and technical AI development teams can use to assess their AI and machine learning systems, models, and data sets for different risks, things like fairness and transparency. With this framework, stakeholders can see technical assessment results in the context of ethical, regulatory, and financial risk. Assessment is a critical foundation for responsible AI governance and development worldwide. We hope that by open sourcing Credo AI Lens, we can make it easy, free, and a no-brainer for all organizations to develop responsible AI. Practically speaking, we've developed our own testing methodology based on industry best practices and cutting-edge research, as well as the policy ecosystem, and distilled this into 6 key tenets, which we use to frame responsible AI. Happy to hear that 4 of these overlap with those that Brenda has already identified. And the tenets that we use to assess our models are fairness, transparency, safety and security, privacy, social and environmental impact, and accountability. Our work is not abstract. We provide real tools to measure these tenets for customers. There's so much conversation about responsible technological development. As Brenda also said, the OECD has over 1,000 AI governance frameworks, but we are intent on making that conversation applicable through our product. So going from principles to practice. Our platform is simple and practical, and it's a way for companies to have evidence-based governance of their AI datasets and models. We recognize that particularly in this line of work, words matter. For example, we choose to use the word transparency instead of explainability because transparency is about so much more than explainability. It includes things like making documentation, such as model cards, available and ensuring that users from all different backgrounds can understand how a system works. As nomenclature is decided, we urge policymakers to partner with researchers and industry to jointly find solutions that make sense. What good looks like is still actively being defined. In the world of AI governance, there is a strong desire to eliminate the black box and create transparency. We have encountered phrases such as readiness assessment, technical documentation, set of guardrails, and certification scheme, all used by policymakers as they attempt to create this transparency for AI datasets and models. We need a common taxonomy in this space, but also one that can be operationalized, which accounts for the fact that AI models are designed and perform differently based on their use cases. Therefore, their assessments and measurements must also vary based on the design and deployment intention for both the dataset and the model. One of the biggest challenges to making our responsible AI tenets a reality is the translation process, translating high-level policy authorship that has already been released into actionable requirements for AI and machine learning systems. We must answer the question, how does this tenet actually affect decisions about the development and deployment of the AI system? So this is what we do. At Credo, we believe that AI is industry-specific, application-specific, and context-driven. We're encouraged by approaches like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and the EU AI Act, both of which align with this view and take context into consideration. We see the UK approaching this similarly, also making the case for context in relation to governing AI systems. We're encouraged by approaches like that of the Department of Defense, DIU, unit, and their responsible AI guidelines, which had the clear goals of being actionable, concrete, realistic, adaptive, provocative, and useful, which we have already operationalized within our platform. AI cannot set the objective for you. As Cassie Kozyrkov, Chief Data Scientist at Google, eloquently said, that is the human's job. Intended purpose is a key factor for determining how to hold an AI model and its creators and users accountable. Did the model behave as required by the use case is the type of question we ask, rather than, is this model biased? There is no real view of what good looks like for most AI use cases, and organizations do not know what to measure or how to tell whether what they're measuring is good. We see this happen in industry with many of our customers who are building AI and machine learning today. That brings us to what we view as the greatest challenge, moving from principles to practice. We've observed great technical steps forward in explainability, bias measurement, adversarial attacks, and the security of AI systems. While these technical challenges are real, they are also being very effectively addressed by researchers. I think Brenda made a great point on companies using responsible AI as a marketing ploy, and we have experienced that for every company developing AI and machine learning systems, every dollar counts. And asking nicely to develop a responsible AI system and a responsible AI value chain is not effective.
Maybe I'm just going to ask you to wrap up.
Sure. So brings me to my final point, which is that we think the challenge for policymakers is creating mandatory checks for industry, which require them to invest in responsible AI while preserving the flexibility that's essential to this field. We think that one way of doing this would be specific and targeted compliance checks throughout the entire AI value chain. So I'll reiterate that there's no one metric that's the key answer or the one-size-all-fits solution, but we do hope to partner with policymakers as they attempt to determine what works best.
Super. Thank you very much. Last on this panel, we'll hear from Evangelos Razis. Close enough?
Very close. Thank you.
Thank you. He is the senior manager at Workday. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Congressman, members of the AI Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to join today's field hearing and to speak on the timely and critical issue of AI governance. My name is Evangelos Razis. I join you on behalf of Workday, where I lead federal engagement on AI and data privacy policy. Prior to joining Workday, I was here at the U.S. Chamber, where I was Director of International Digital Economy Policy and co-led the drafting of the Chamber's AI principles in 2019. A software as a service company, Workday is a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications for finance and human resources, helping our customers adapt and thrive in a changing world. Our applications have been adopted by thousands of organizations in the US, Europe, and globally, from medium-sized businesses to more than 50% of the Fortune 500. At Workday, we believe in delivering innovation that unlocks human potential and understand the opportunity that AI offers to positively transform how people and organizations operate. Workday incorporates machine learning into our software to enable enterprise customers to make more informed decisions and empower workers to identify, communicate, and grow their job-related skills. For AI-based technologies to have the positive impact that they are capable of, Workday believes that we must have a strong foundation of trust, namely trust that organizations are developing and using AI in a responsible manner. A 2021 survey by Axios found that a bipartisan majority of Americans believe that government oversight of the use of algorithms is needed, with many expressing distrust in the use of AI to process loan applications, make hiring decisions, and drive vehicles. This is why Workday supports smart AI policy, which we would characterize as regulation that is risk-based, centers on the use of AI impact assessments, and recognizes the different roles and responsibilities in the AI ecosystem. My remarks today will briefly discuss these three elements, which are also described in a white paper Workday published last year, which I would be pleased to submit into the record for the Commission's benefit and consideration. Before I do so, I should share why we believe that federal action is needed in the AI space, recognizing, of course, that many existing and mature legal standards do exist, as Brenda so artfully pointed out. Simply put, policymakers in Washington, D.C. are not alone in wanting to address the AI trust gap. In state capitals and city halls around the country, lawmakers are taking action. Last November, the New York City Council enacted an ordinance regulating the use of AI hiring tools. Similar proposals regulating the use of AI have been introduced in New York State, New Jersey, and California state legislatures, and here in the District of Columbia. Across the Atlantic, our friends in the European Union continue to develop and refine the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is expected to pass into law. To those of us who follow data privacy, this emerging landscape sounds familiar. In lieu of federal leadership, state and local governments weave a patchwork of law at home, while the European Union sets a global benchmark for comprehensive regulation abroad. Workday is therefore pleased that the House Energy and Commerce Committee took the important step yesterday of voting out the bipartisan American Data Privacy and Protection Act. Thanks to recent improvements to the bill, the ADPPA has moved toward a risk-based approach to AI and embraces AI impact assessments. While we intend to continue working closely with the bill's authors, the ADPPA represents meaningful progress toward a national framework for AI and privacy policy. Such a framework is needed to avoid a regulatory patchwork at the state level and bolsters U.S. AI leadership abroad. Now, moving forward to those three elements, I'll begin first by talking about a risk-based approach. Workday supports a risk-based approach to AI regulation because this ensures that organizations and regulators can focus their scarce resources on the AI applications that pose the greatest potential harm to individuals. Given the thousands of potential AI applications, each with different risk profiles, one-size-fits-all approaches to regulating AI systems will not work. The risk-based approach to AI governance focuses on the consequential decisions that have the potential to infringe on an individual's legal right to access housing, education, employment, healthcare, and other basic goods and services without harmful discrimination. Adopting a risk-based approach to AI governance is also essential to ensuring interoperability between AI regulations across borders. At Congress's direction, NIST is establishing a voluntary framework for AI risk management, which is scheduled to be completed this winter. At its core, the EU's AI Act also adopts a risk-based approach to governing AI applications. As we have seen in multiple joint statements from the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, risk management can serve as a common language for AI governance on both sides of the Atlantic, bridging these and future AI policy actions. Second, moving on to impact assessments. Workday also supports AI policies that center on the use of impact assessments. Impact assessments are a mature tool already used by organizations for privacy and data protection purposes. Organizations can use impact assessments to identify and mitigate potential risks that can emerge throughout the AI system's lifecycle. It can serve as an important assurance mechanism that promotes accountability and enhances trust that high-risk AI systems have been designed, developed, tested, and deployed with sufficient protections in place to mitigate the risk of harm. AI impact assessments are also an important transparency mechanism that enables the many potential stakeholders involved in the design, development, and deployment of an AI system to communicate about its risks and ensure the responsibilities for mitigating those risks are clearly understood by all parties. Impact assessments stand in contrast to other AI accountability tools that have been floated in policy discussions, such as mandatory third-party audits, which require technical and organizational standards to function properly. Indeed, organizations developing and deploying high-risk AI systems can carry out impact assessments themselves and in conjunction with their vendors in a manner similar to the data protection impact assessments required under GDPR. Consequently, AI impact assessments offer a way for policymakers to effectively and pragmatically address the AI trust gap today without harming innovation. As Avi had pointed out, it is a key tool for turning principles into practice. My third point in terms of recognizing different actors in the AI ecosystem. Building trust in AI is truly a responsibility shared by developers, deployers, and end users of AI. The role of each of these stakeholders within the AI governance lifecycle, however, is conditioned by different technical, legal, and organizational considerations, which vary from context to context. Enterprise software providers, for example, are best placed to understand how an AI system is designed, but they typically do not have full visibility into how their customers are using their AI tools due to various technical, legal, and contractual limitations, including for data protection requirements. Consequently, deployers of AI tools are usually better positioned than developers to understand the specific organizational context where tools being used and communicate directly to end users. With that, I want to thank the Commission for their hard work and for the invitation to speak. Obviously, these are issues of high stakes, as Suzanne had mentioned, and look forward to the conversation with you all and my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all three of our panelists. We're going to jump right into questions. This is not usually a shy group. We've got a question. Rachel?
So thank you all. This is all super helpful and interesting. Mine's kind of an odd question. I actually wanted Avi and Brenda's reaction actually to this suggestion, this tension between impact assessments, which I think you're suggesting that companies do themselves versus a third party assessing the life cycle. I just wanted to explore that and get your reaction either way, to those They seem like the opposing positions.
Did you go first?
I mean, I think honestly, they both have a role. Audits don't have to be externally imposed as in the way that these laws have, where it's an independent third party. I think internal audits definitely have a role and they can be complementary to impact assessments. Impact assessments tend to be planning and forward-looking. Audits are more monitoring and, maintenance focused, or at least can be. The drawbacks to either, especially to being done internally, is just commitment and resources internal to the company. So having any sort of external balance or review of those, give it, validity and heft is, I think, necessary from a regulatory standpoint, just because not every company will devote the resources or the sincerity to doing them accurately. And it's very difficult to do an impact assessment. I mean, it's a lot to do. It does reduce the regulatory burden in other ways, but it's not a checklist that can just be done, on somebody's desk in half an hour. There's a lot of work behind that to do it well, to do it right. I thought.
I think I would just add to that I think context is key for every type of evaluation. And so impact assessments are one way to evaluate different tenets of responsibility for a system and its model. But I think that they're not the only way. And I think, as Brenda has illustrated very well, there's a need to implement different types of checks throughout the entire value chain. Evangelos mentioned ADPPA, which has this impact assessment piece. And I think there's still a question of, well, what algorithms would even qualify for that impact assessment? I think that the threshold of acceptability is very subjective and it is very much case by case basis. So it depends on what the model is being developed for and what it's being used for.
If I may react a little bit.
I didn't mean to.
No, it's a great question, and certainly how a lot of policymakers, especially at the state and local level, are thinking about this issue. Do we go for an impact assessment or do we go to a third-party audit? I completely agree that there are multiple accountability tools that are available. I think at the same time, there is this sort of trust gap, which is right in front of us. To do audits well, especially if you're going to include a third party, requires some advanced technical standards. It requires some commonality around what are professional ethics around auditing AI. What are some, are there ISO, IEC standards, for example? We see that in the privacy and the cybersecurity space. Audits work because they have that pretty advanced and decades-long technical underpinning to it to make sure that they're credible. And so I think we sort of recognize that, AI is a developing policy area, it's a developing technology, but at the same time, there is this sort of need for federal action to address trust, but also to keep up with policymakers at the state and local level and our friends in Europe.
Other questions?
Yeah.
So let's drill down one more layer, because obviously all roads in the policy land right now lead to some sort of either impact assessment, auditing, or as the Europeans call it, prior conformity assessment. So assuming the US does not adopt the EU style, more of a top-down approach to audits and assessments, and there is more of a self-regulatory focus driven or backed by the NIST framework, what does the output look like? So maybe, Evie, you can tell us what your company provides at the end of the day. We're going to be hearing from Mary Vogel later, who with Equal AI is providing sort of a badge program. Like, so there's some sort of a certification that comes out, almost like an underwriter's laboratory kind of process, some sort of a stamp of approval. Or is it ISO, IEEE, ACM driven with some sort of professional credentialed approach to, like, saying you have certified professionals who've gone through it? I mean, we need to know more about the outputs to the extent that we do not get a more formalistic and regulatory approach to this. What would be the alternative and the sort of ins and outs?
Yeah, I'm happy to react first. I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that's obvious from the policy perspective. But when you're looking at the technology, I don't think that there is sort of that one size fits all or the best model. I think test beds, regulatory sandboxing are one of the best steps forward to take to ensure that we can look at what assessments work for different sectors and different models, because I think it is very context specific and context driven. So the NIST risk management framework, for example, is a series of tools that can be applied depending on how the model is developed and where it's deployed. Because I think, again, that threshold of acceptability is going to vary based on the use case. So I would say there's no one assessment that we would advocate for, but more so a conversation and an opportunity for the developers to come together with policymakers to discuss why the assessment is being made. What is the threshold of acceptability particular to that use case? I mean, I can give many examples, but for a facial recognition system, if you have a threshold of acceptability for a system that's being used to open a phone versus a system that's being used at border control, acceptability and variation of error is very different.
But when someone goes through your process that you're offering.
Yeah.
What's the output? I mean, in a regulatory context, it would be approval.
Yep.
Right? In a self-regulatory context, it would be what? Certification of some sort or a stamp of approval?
A lot of what we provide is technical documentation. So artifacts as to how the data set and model are being used. So basically an explanation of what the model is doing and how it was trained.
Gotcha.
If I could answer that as well, we do similar types of processes. The core business that we do is model audits for companies, because as I described in my comments, believe and are working with companies that believe that they already have mandates, that they must be able to show that their model-based systems meet in employment and in finance and in healthcare and in these highly regulated fields. So we do model audits of their existing systems with the outcome appropriate, whatever the compliance category is. We might give them the identification certification that they can use in an external facing context, just if they're operating under HIPAA guidelines, to say that they meet the standards for the identification. We might give them some sort of internal.
Brenda, can I just interrupt you for a second? Folks who are joining online, we've got a large group. If you could do your best to keep yourself on mute, if you're not being recognized, that would be great. We're getting a little feedback here in the headquarters.
And when we do an audit based on, for example, the anti-discrimination standards that I talked about, we show what the output of the model, where the output of the model falls. We might work to mitigate or ameliorate, build a legal argument around business necessity where things don't match up, if that's an allowable context. And then again, get them to a point where they can show a performance level to a regulator, to an industry auditor, to whoever that would reflect the performance of their model. And
Would you issue a public report on that company once they ask for it to show to regulators or others they've been approved?
If the company wants that. So what we provide can include a public facing piece that can have attorney-client privilege waived so that it can be used externally. And that's at the requirement of the company. We've talked to a lot of companies who are starting to explore that option for the New York City law, especially if it gets picked up at the state level by different states, as to what that might look like and how we might work with that.
Thank you. You want to address that?
Yeah, happy to. I think we're very comfortable with the regulatory backstop. Definitely not a sort of pre-conformity assessment process, which I know has caused a lot of discussion in the EU about the potential impacts on innovation, which is certainly promoting innovation is a priority, a stated priority of the AI Act. And so we are very comfortable with again, still working out the specifics, but I think we're very comfortable with the FTC, for example, with some sort of reasonable grounds, either asking for documentation if there is of an impact assessment, for example, if there's concerns around harm to consumers. But I think that regulatory backstop is needed to, again, signal to consumers, signal to the ecosystem that there is trust in the process.
And that backstop is with existing unfair and deceptive practices authority or new statutory authority through algorithmic accountability?
I would say certainly not the Algorithmic Accountability Act, while that proposal is certainly has its some merits. There are areas that are quite prescriptive. And still, needs to be worked out, as any complicated piece of legislation oftentimes needs quite a few drafts. That said, I think it is an open question. I think we're still working to figure it out with like many folks around the table.
Very, very diplomatic. I really like that. Thank you to our first panel. Really appreciate your participation. You're welcome to stay as long as your schedule allows. We want to take a 2-minute break, just really to allow switching in and out from first panel to second panel. But thank you all very much for being here today. Some of you probably heard my remarks at the beginning of that panel about how my hardest job is being the mean guy who tries to keep us on schedule. In that category, first panel is the easiest because there were only 3 of them. If you look around, there's 5 of you. So we're gonna work even harder to try to stay on schedule here. And let me first thank you all for being here. Welcome. I didn't get a chance at the first panel. I got to practice their names ahead of time. So this panel I did not. So I hope you'll give me a little extra generosity as I work my way through pronunciation. So we're going to get started with our second panel. I'm going to go in order of the agenda that's in front of me. First, we'll hear from Rama Elluru.
Excellent.
Pretty close anyway.
Excellent.
Rama is the Senior Director for Society and Intellectual Property at the Special Competitive Studies Project. If you have other credentials, you're welcome to share them as well. That's everything I have in front of me, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Representative Ferguson and Commissioners, for the opportunity to speak with you today on intellectual property and artificial intelligence. In the fall of 2019, I was detailed from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, where I served as an administrative patent judge to the National Security Commission on AI. Thanks to my co-panelists here, actually. The Congress established the NSC/AI in the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act that mandated the commission was to analyze and provide recommendations for the methods and means necessary to advance artificial intelligence and associated technologies to comprehensively address U.S. national security. My colleague and former director of the NSC/AI, Elluru, will give a more in-depth discussion of the commission in the next panel. The Commission on AI dissolved last October per the Commission's congressional mandate. In March of 2021, we issued a comprehensive final report that was 756 pages with a chapter focused on the intersection of intellectual property and AI. I'd like to share the Commission's IP recommendations with you today. Chapter 12 includes 2 core messages. First, our intellectual property regimes are antiquated and need to be modernized in the tech era that we find ourselves in. Second, the United States must recognize IP policy as a national security priority critical for preserving America's leadership in AI and other emerging technologies. America's IP regimes, which includes patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets, has spurred American ingenuity since the 18th century with the 1790 Patent Act. The last major overhaul of the patent system was in the early 1950s, right before AI emerged in the field in 1956. U.S. government stakeholders with IP equity span all 3 branches, but there's no single federal entity empowered to develop comprehensive IP strategies across the government. The U.S. lacks a cohesive emerging tech IP strategy that safeguards and is integrated into national security, economic, and tech competitiveness strategies. The result is that the U.S. could lose its IP global leadership position, including its influence over other countries adopting its technologies. This is especially important in light of China's effort to leverage and exploit its IP policies, which have significant and domestic international implications for the United States. The domestic harm is that we lack sufficient incentives for IP. The international harm is that the U.S. loses its IP leadership position, allowing China to attract innovation to its borders. Given the global tech competition that we find ourselves in, the NSC/AI recommended that the United States develop and implement national IP policies to incentivize, expand, and protect AI and other emerging technologies. The overarching recommendation was that the president should issue an executive order to recognize IP as a national priority and require the development of a comprehensive plan to reform and create IP policies and regimes. First, the executive order should direct the vice president as chair of the Technology Competitive Council, another one of the NSC/AI recommendations, or otherwise as chair of an interagency task force to oversee this effort. It should also direct the Secretary of Commerce in coordination with the USPTO director to develop proposals to reform and establish new IP policies and regimes. The proposal should include both executive and legislative actions to achieve these objectives. The Commerce Secretary and the USPTO director should coordinate with other relevant government entities and convene deliberations, and where necessary, establish a committee of multidisciplinary experts within and outside the government. And the executive order should direct the vice president to assess which IP proposals come up from the Secretary of Commerce that should be integrated into national security, economic, and tech competitive strategies. And importantly, the Secretary of Commerce should be empowered to implement these proposals. Lastly, it should direct the executive branch departments and agencies to resource and support this effort as a whole of government approach. Finally, the NSCI proposed a list, non-exhaustive list of 10 IP considerations that should be assessed as part of this executive order or through separate prioritization of IP by the White House, Secretary of Commerce, and the USPTO Director. The 10 considerations include U.S. patent eligibility, assess and articulate the impact of the current United States patent eligibility doctrine on innovation in AI and emerging technologies from a national security, trade, and economic perspective. While China is making it easier to acquire patent rights, U.S. courts have severely restricted patent protection for computer-implemented and biotech-related inventions. And to give you an example, recently the Supreme Court denied certiorari in a case involving an invention over a vehicle drive shaft that was resilient to vibrations. And the courts held that it was not eligible for patent protection because it was based on a natural law. I believe it was Hooke's law. So the expansiveness of the judicial exceptions to patent eligibility has severely restricted the subject matter that is eligible for patent protection. 2, China also has filed massive amounts of patent applications domestically and internationally. And China ensures its presence in standard-setting organizations and aggressively asserts its patents as standard essential. We need to assess how we can best counter this narrative that China has won the innovation competition based in part on its patent filings. 3, assess whether the USPTO requires additional resources to ensure high-quality patent examination, including assessing the impacts of increasing filings from China and AI-generated prior art. 4, assess impediments to the IP contractual ecosystem and proper mechanisms to strengthen the AI public-private partnership and international collaboration. IP protections for data. Number 5, assess the need for additional protections for data, including legislation if IP protections are deemed necessary, as well as ways to encourage sharing of data sets. Combating IP theft. We need additional executive branch efforts to counter IP theft threats. The statistics I've seen recently are that $2 billion to $6 billion of U.S. IP theft from China, which is quite massive and probably not even really telling of the actual numbers, given that future market effects are also hard to place. 6, number 7, inventorship by AI. Assess the need for policies relating to AI-generated inventions and creations. Number 8, work with allies and partners on global AI-related IP alignment. 9, we need to expand the innovation base and democratize access to innovation IP ecosystems. And lastly, number 10, standardization and patent process. We need to assess policies to protect the integrity of processes by which standardization patents are claimed, asserted, and litigated. I'm happy to go into depth on any of these topics. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Very helpful and really on time. So thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Appolo Tankeh, professor from Bowie State University. Was I close?
Very close.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good, I'm glad.
Thank you, Chairman and the Commission, for the opportunity to talk here. Also, thanks for my panel being here with you today. I've been in the IT industry for more than 25 years now. I spent 20 years in IBM as a team lead for supercomputer. We have this high performance computer that the US government always partner with Cray, IBM, and other American companies to invest in it in order to increase our competitiveness. I must say that when I started as a young man, arriving from London Imperial College and Cambridge, joining IBM and a team where we'll sit on a similar table like this in order to determine if we will be able to develop a system that will compete with other systems overseas. One of the things that you would hardly see will be whether that system will actually make a profit. We know that it will not make a profit, that the HPC computing would not make a profit for IBM and for other companies such as Credo. But we did know that what we are embarking on, which usually would take 5 to 6 years to build such a supercomputer. When I joined in 2000, we were working on what you call ASCII pop. We're competing with others in that space to be able to win that contract. And we did not release that machine until sometime 2005. But what we do in such enterprise, including engineers like myself and scientists involved, is that we develop certain intellectual property that diffuse itself in society in ways that it would be hard to expand here. But I usually give lectures to students around when I talk about Linux operational system and the history of it, and going back to 2000 when Linux just started. And I can go from a very piece of invention in Linux and then trying to expand it to show how it impacts society in terms of the commercial implication of it, in terms of the military implication of that invention, and so on and so forth. So for the course of this 20 years, so competition have been at the heart of my work. I started looking at this as a young man when we had similar situations with the Soviet Union, and we needed to develop a weapon system such as strategic defense initiative in order to defend ourselves. And we all see with that history. It's all interwoven, even though some of the work that we've done in developing such a system, such as Blue Gene and high performance computing, they are to be used in commercial application, but they also have implication to how we defend ourselves as a nation. So the situation we face right now in the competitive space, the IP, and also in our own prowess with China, is a very serious one. And I would just come on in my own reading in the course of that history, that what we saw in terms of the spending that we put in R&D in order to create a defensive system that eventually led to Gorbachev and Reagan agreeing on a table. Engineers like myself play a major part. So that is some of my recommendations to the community to also seek out people like myself and others that have some view of this history and see some powers that are going in the with our relationship with the IP and AI with China and some of the precedents that we have. And Russia was one of them with a defensive system, which we eventually took the race to Russia, and they eventually gave up. And the rest is history today. As you see, the Eastern Europe was able to be liberalized to share similar values like we do share. So that's one of my comments. The other comment I do have is with respect to some of the benchmark that, Eric Schmidt and others are part of other committee that's been looking at this issue. They have been worried that perhaps we don't know exactly where we are with respect to the race with China. And this is not new. This has precedent too. So even during the Cold War, they have time when we don't exactly know with the Soviet weapon, the kind of a weapon that they have. And some of the scientists do during those times help us to be able to find other technology in order to survey that. But right now, it is much harder to survey exactly what China has and what we have and who is actually leading. So one of the reasons why that is happening is probably because of the nature in which that technology is an open source technology, which means that when an AI researcher publishes a paper, everybody around the world, because of the nature of being intellectually open source, can have access to it. And therefore, they could go ahead and implement it. So that gives sometimes a newcomer, which means starter like China, a little bit of advantage, particularly because they are coming from behind. There's some advantage that is newcomer comes in an innovative process that they always have a certain advantage. But is that advantage sustainable or not? That is certain questions that, we don't know that yet. So maybe some of the things that we're saying is a little bit exaggerated, whether they actually had. So those are still issues that need to be looked into. I could go on other issues equally.
I'm just going to ask you to wrap up.
Yes, other technology have been coming up to which we also would like to have some kind of speed up in terms of regulation, and that is blockchain. And its integration with AI is becoming very rapid recently, particularly here in the US and other places. And China is trying to kind of move quickly ahead in that area. So I will stop there. I continue. If there's any questions.
There will be.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we are going to have questions at the end of, after everyone has a chance to present. Next, we hear from Wen Zi, partner at Global IP Counselors, LLP.
Yes, hi.
Yours.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Wen Shea, and I am a U.S. patent attorney, and I represent stakeholders before the USPTO as they pursue patent protection in the United States. I would like to make a case for why the American innovation system should enable the explicit protection of AI through patents. I would then highlight the existing legal barriers to protecting AI innovations. First, the reasons we should patent AI. AI is an emerging technology. It is not yet integrated with every aspect of society. Far from it, the greatest AI experts are emerging in pockets, such as in startups, small companies, and labs dedicated to the building and design of AI models. Many of these pockets are not yet known, even in their field of expertise. AI is not yet integrated with the manufacturing industry, those who make machines and mechanical parts. The makers of machines and mechanical parts are partnering with AI labs to design their next generation products. Autonomous vehicles, centralized air conditioning systems operated by Internet of Things technology. Unfortunately, there's not a big newsletter that informs the tech industry of what everyone is working on. Companies and manufacturers use patent disclosures to learn about emerging fields of research, determine the best partners who to invest in. The current unstable nature of U.S. patent laws surrounding AI and software inventions overall has enhanced the risk assessment of companies, including small companies and startups, when it comes to filing for a patent. Should we disclose our invention and research in a patent application just for it to be immediately rendered part of the public domain? The unstable nature of the current patent system unduly enhances the risk of seeking a patent. How many efficient cross-industry collaborations are we losing out on as a society due to companies choosing to forego this risk, particularly for small companies and startups? Could they have secured more funding? Have they been able to disclose their invention and emerge victorious in prosecution? Another reason to patent AI is that models for building AI are actually being implemented into commercial products throughout several industries. Take autonomous vehicles, for instance. AI designers are working on anticipatory and predictive modules such that vehicles can be more and more capable of independent decisions. To do so, they are building AI models to train AI with all the infinite types of real-world navigation scenarios that may be encountered by a vehicle during use. That is, in order to train AI for autonomous vehicles, commercial non-autonomous vehicles for sale are being equipped with the capability to gather information for training AI. around the world for sale and public use of an invention without a patent application within 1 year of disclosure is dedicating that invention to the public. These AI models would take years to build and perfect, but to get there, they need to be implemented with commercial products today. Again, inventors or companies must assess the risk. Do we invest in this technology that may take years of R&D investment just for it to be rendered free game for all of our competitors? The American innovation system needs to be predictable and stable to foster the growth of critical emerging technologies such as AI in order to incentivize efficient and worthwhile long-term investments. So, why isn't the current system sufficient? It is well established in patent law to exclude from patentability mental processes. Patenting human mental processes is subject to abuse. However, our traditional perceptions must adapt in light of the developing technology, particularly computer innovations. Otherwise, our laws will become antiquated in the field of innovation. AI, by its definition, is a computer processing information in a way that mirrors what a human being can do. In the United States, computer-implemented processes have been deemed mere abstract ideas that are not subject to patent eligibility. This practice stems from the Supreme Court's landmark case in Alice versus CLS Bank in 2014, in which the court established a judicially created rule for determining patent-eligible subject matter. This case set forth a legal standard that the invention must possess something more than what is well understood, routine, and conventional in order to establish the very basis of patent eligibility. Under Alice, inventions claiming physical computer components such as processors, computer memory, have been deemed abstract ideas. Under Alice, claims to garage door openers and methods for adjusting a vehicle drivetrain are deemed abstract ideas not eligible for a patent. Now, you may say that, of course, we should not be able to patent something that is well understood, routine, or conventional. I agree. Our country should not grant patents to inventions that are routine or conventional. The problem, however, is that the subject matter eligibility statute of 101, Section 101 under Title 35 does not provide any basis for the establishment of an evidentiary standard. Section 101 only states, whoever invents or discovers any new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new and useful improvement thereof may obtain a patent, therefore, subject to the conditions and requirements of this title. But what is the fact finder referencing when determining when the invention is well understood, routine, or conventional? Section 101 is silent with respect to any evidentiary basis for this assessment. To make this point, compare 101 with 102 and 103, the statutes governing novelty and obviousness. I'll start with 103. I'm going to be paraphrasing. A patent for a claimed invention may not be obtained if the differences between the claimed invention and the prior art are such that the claimed invention as a whole would have been obvious. So 103 says that the fact finder must reference the prior art to establish the differences. What counts as prior art is established in Section 102, which states that prior art is an invention that was patented or described in printed publication or public use or sale. Therefore, an examiner can reference prior patents, prior applications, prior sales, or public use to make a determination of novelty or obviousness. The question of what's well understood, routine, or conventional is by its very nature a question of law based on underlying facts, just like novelty and obviousness. Just like novelty and obviousness, it must be resolved on the basis of factual inquiries. You need facts and evidence to establish what is well understood, routine, and conventional in order to determine what is more than well understood, routine, and conventional. But instead of referencing facts or evidence in the prior art, patent applications are denied as unpatentable subject matter based on nothing but conclusory opinions. And this has been the case from the examining court at the USPTO to the judges on the federal circuit. In the past, the USPTO has attempted to rectify this problem by issuing guidance on the matter. The USPTO's subject matter eligibility guidance was limited in its effect because the agency could not effectively set standards for this type of factually based examination under Section 101. The agency couldn't just tell the examiners, establish what's routine by referencing prior art. Which is why the question of what is well understood or known in the art is already established in the statutes governing novelty and obviousness. When 103 is properly assessed under the manual patent examination procedure, obviousness is a factual inquiry subject to the preponderance of the evidence standard that more likely than not the invention was disclosed as obvious in light of the teachings of prior art references. When the USPTO fails to establish a preponderance of the evidence, Applicant has grounds for appeal, both within the agency and to the federal circuit. The USPTO's procedure allows for applicants' rebuttal to prove non-obviousness. The procedure allows for referencing commercial success, long-felt need, and other secondary considerations. The procedure allows for a process of affidavit practice in which applicants can submit statements from those skilled in the art to establish evidentiary grounds of what is obvious or novel. None of this procedure occurs when a factual inquiry arises under Section 101. Applicants have had little to no procedural or legal recourse when faced with a 101 rejection. Our current procedure on subject matter eligibility is unfair. It is bad for innovators, it's bad for our innovation economy, and it corrodes America's reputation as a world leader. China
Ask you to wrap up.
China and Europe also do not allow for patenting mental processes, yet they do not have a subject matter eligibility crisis as we do. They have allowed for the patenting of artificial intelligence forthright. Congress should amend Section 101 to state explicitly the computer structures and hardware are patent eligible structure. Congress should amend Section 101 to state explicitly that steps or means carried out by computer structures, whether individually or in combination, are patent eligible. Lastly, on the issue of AI inventorship, AI should not be inventors of patents. Patent inventorship governs patent ownership, whereas whoever is the inventor is the owner of the patent. So will the AI be assigning the patent over to a human or a corporation will be the questions that you would then have to answer. Will the AI then be asserting its patent in district court are the questions you will then have to answer. Simply, the creators, the inventors of AI-generated inventions should be the creator or the creators of the AI, as they would be the ones who would be incentivized to innovate by the patent system anyway. Very much.
Thank you very much. I'm from New Jersey, so we speak fast. Because it also keeps you from being interrupted. It's good. I like that. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from Andrei Iancu. Good enough. Andrei, sorry. Andrei's good. Yeah, great. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Congressman Ferguson, commissioners. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for holding this really, really important set of sessions. I'm an IP lawyer. I'm in private practice at IRL and Manila in Los Angeles. I'm here on my own behalf. Everything I say is they're my own opinions. For 3 years, I was director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and I had the privilege of working with Judge Elluru here to my left, as well as Mr. Hannon, who I'm sure is going to speak next. So I want to back up a little bit and address a couple of the points, first of all, that have already been made. Number one, that we must modernize our intellectual property system when it comes to artificial intelligence. And in particular, though, the question is what to modernize. And Ms. G mentioned Section 101. That is the patentable subject matter section of the patent code. That section defines what's in the patent system and what's out of the patent system. For example, a machine, generally speaking, if it's new and novel and non-obvious, we can give it a patent. A painting is out of the patent system. We don't give it a patent. That's Section 101. The problem is that section was written word for word by Jefferson and Madison in 1793. And I'm not kidding. That section has not been readdressed by Congress since 1793. And I don't know if it came up when you were in Congress.
Hey, don't blame me, okay?
But it certainly hasn't happened since. And as brilliant as our founders were, they were, and the patent code that they put in place was fantastic. However, they still did not anticipate DNA processing, artificial intelligence, cryptography, software code, and all of the modern technologies of the next industrial revolution. So to say that the patent system, at least from that perspective, needs to be modernized, it's an understatement. It is absolutely crucial, and it is a matter of immediate national security. And let me get a little bit more detailed and explain why. First of all, what exactly about AI are we talking about when we speak about intellectual property? Two major categories. First of all, should artificial intelligence algorithms be patentable or not? Should they be within the statute, Section 101, but just within the patent statute? or should they not be? And number two, should an artificial intelligence algorithm be allowed to be an inventor of a patent? Because we are at the day where artificial intelligence programs can themselves innovate and create new things. Should those things created by an AI system be allowed to get a patent or not? These issues we are far behind. We must address as a country, because otherwise we're falling behind. And it's great that the Chamber is beginning this discussion now. Now, why is it important to consider intellectual property for these questions? Because in my opinion, in a free market economy, there is no better tool to ensure technological progress. First of all, intellectual property protections, including patents and the like, incentivize investments in risky, long-term technologies. We're a free market economy. We don't have a centralized dictatorship where the central state can say, we don't care what happens in the rest of the country, but you must, industry, invest billions of dollars in these 3, 4, or 5 industries. We don't have such a thing, and we shouldn't. We're a free market economy. But as a result, some mechanism needs to be in place in order for private industry to make these risky investments and be sure that if successful, they will be able to capitalize on them at the end of the road. Second of all, patents incentivize public disclosure. You get a patent in exchange for telling the public how you have done it, so others after you can come and create on top of what you have done, and that is the very definition of technological progress. Without it, every new inventor would have to reinvent the wheel, as they say from the very beginning. Third, intellectual property and patents in particular ensure the transfer of that technology. As Ms. Xi mentioned, the collaboration between various labs, the collaboration between companies, the transfer of technology from one company to another so you can jointly create something or to expand upon it. Without it, you don't have the faith that your technology will not be misappropriated. So for these reasons, without these protections, we risk falling behind. And in many areas, unfortunately, we already have. The NSCAI report that Ms. Elluru mentioned, identifies that we might fall behind when it comes to AI. Depending how you look at it, whether it's 5G or 6G or AI or other technologies, we have already begun to fall behind, and we have to find ways as a nation to incentivize those investments. Semiconductor technology, cryptography, quantum computing, all technologies that are super risky, super expensive, and have a long-term horizon where our companies need the protections of the law in order to feel comfortable to make those investments. And if as a free market economy, we don't address the law structure, the legal structure that enables this, we have no other mechanism and we're almost guaranteed to fall behind. So we must right now as a nation begin the dialogue on the policy implications and how to balance those policies in order to achieve the right system for our country. And I'm grateful that the Chamber once again is beginning this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Andrei, thank you very much. Last on this panel, we'll hear from Christian Hannon, patent attorney at the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Christian,
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman, for the introduction. Thanks to the Chamber and the Commission for inviting the USPTO to speak here today. So a key priority for the USPTO is to maintain the U.S. leadership in innovation, especially in emerging technologies and artificial intelligence. To do this, we must incentivize more innovation in areas like AI by ensuring robust and reliable patent rights and tapping into all groups of innovators from across the country. To further this goal, the USPTO has been actively engaging with the innovation community and experts in AI to promote the understanding and reliability of IP rights as they relate to AI technologies, especially. The USPTO has also been working across the agency, government, and industry, including through the Council for Inclusive Innovation, to encourage more innovation across the country, to promote economic prosperity and US competitiveness, and to connect innovators, individuals, small and medium enterprises, and those in traditionally underrepresented communities to the resources that they need to protect innovation and bring it to impact. This past month, the USPTO announced the formation of our AI and Emerging Technologies Partnership. We held our first meeting on June 29th. This AI and ET partnership, as we know it, provides an opportunity for independent inventors, small businesses, representatives from academia, industry, federal agencies, nonprofits, and other shareholders to share their perspectives, experiences, and insights. And it fosters opportunities to collaborate at the intersection of IP, AI, and other emerging technologies. In response to a request from Congress, the USPTO also has recently issued a request for comment and published a report on June 28th on the extent to which our current patent laws impact investment and innovation in critical technologies such as artificial intelligence. The report, titled Patent Eligible Subject Matter, Public Views on the Current Jurisprudence in the United States, makes clear that while there are divergent views among stakeholders regarding the Supreme Court's jurisprudence that we've heard talked about here today, technologies that are eligible for patent protection may vary depending on what industry you're in. Therefore, there's general agreement that there is a key incentive that we need to encourage to innovate and make sure that investments in technologies like AI are there, and the laws need to be clear, predictable, and consistent as possible. The USPTO is currently analyzing our own patent eligibility guidance put in place in 2019 to assess whether, within the bounds of the law, it appropriately incentivizes and protects innovation in emerging technologies such as AI. With the same goals in mind, we have also implemented a pilot program for the deferred examination of patent eligibility. This program is designed to evaluate whether examination efficiency and patent quality can be improved by delaying the complete evaluation of subject matter eligibility until other patentability criteria, as we heard discussed, like novelty and non-obviousness, are actually evaluated by an examiner, as opposed to addressing all of these requirements for patentability at the same time. To date, we have sent approximately 600 invitations to participate in this deferred program, and 1/3 of those who have responded have done so affirmatively. We look forward to gathering the data from this pilot program and evaluating how it may inform examination practices, including for patent applications directed to AI and AI-enabled systems. We're also considering guidance for patent examiners on functional claiming, a type of claim limitation that describes something by what it does rather than the actual structural components of the invention. This may present distinct issues for artificial intelligence technologies. In addition to the work within our office, the USPTO is engaged in the international conversations as we continue to evaluate our approach on subject matter eligibility, particularly as it relates to AI. We've had several discussions and roundtables with colleagues from foreign offices, including those in Europe, Japan, Korea, and China, to better understand how other jurisdictions are actually able to determine subject matter eligibility. We have continued those discussions this month in Geneva when the USPTO met with foreign IP leaders at the World Intellectual Property Organization's General Assembly meetings. We are also working with Congress and the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of the Solicitor General to provide technical assistance and other input on patent eligibility, with the goal of creating more certain and predictable rights that foster innovation, including in the area of AI. We will continue to work with the Solicitor General and her office to identify good vehicles for achieving that objective while pursuing all other options in parallel. We look forward to more discussions on this critically important topic and finding a path forward that will optimize our IP laws as they impact AI for the benefit of our country. In addition to the need for clear IP laws that incentivize innovation in AI, we are working to encourage innovation in AI across the country, including in communities that have been traditionally underrepresented. And I mean this in the broadest sense, not only reaching out to ethnic communities and women, but also expanding our outreach to parts of the country and among socioeconomic classes in which Americans have not had the ability to fully participate in our innovation economy. Bringing that innovation to impact is critical for job creation, opportunity, economic prosperity, and U.S. competitiveness. To better understand how AI has been diffusing across our nation, the USPTO recently published a study on the growth of AI as evidenced through patent data. To carry out the study, we actually used machine learning to analyze our own databases. we found that 80,000 of our utility patent applications in 2020 involved AI. That's a 150% increase since 2002. AI now appears in 18% of all utility patent applications received at the PTO, and it's in more than 50% of all the technologies that we examine across the board at the PTO. In addition, 25% of those submitting AI-related applications are individual inventors. They're located well beyond traditional technology hubs. For instance, we found that in Oregon, patentees are using AI in fitness training and equipment. In North Dakota, AI is being used extensively for new agricultural innovations. Inventors from Maine and South Carolina actively use AI in digital data processing adapted for businesses. In Montana, AI is being incorporated into inventions for analyzing the chemical and physical properties of materials. Wisconsin leads in the use of AI applied to medical instruments and processes for diagnosis and surgery. And in Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Ohio, we found that AI technologies are contributing to new inventions in telecommunications. This means we can capitalize on the innovation taking place in all the different industries located in all the different regions of our country. It's not necessary any longer to be in a long-established tech hub to innovate and attract new investment, which suggests that there may be even more opportunities in traditionally underrepresented communities. To summarize, we cannot sustain innovation around AI without robust and reliable IP rights, which are essential to the prosperity of our innovative nation. To grow our economy and stay globally competitive, we must promote invention and patenting more than ever, including in those underserved communities. Thank you all again for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you. Really impressive panel. And fortunately, we have some time for our commissioners to ask some questions. Who's got a question?
So the performance of AI algorithms is a function of the data, the AI architecture itself, the hardware and processes. What components of this AI pipeline would you recommend being included in what's considered patent? This is just very open.
I would say all of those components. I mean, data is obviously very important to AI. And there currently is really no effective incentives for protecting and expanding data sets, as well as sharing those data sets. How can companies be incentivized to share data sets across public-private partnerships, as well as cross borders, if there is no protection for that data, as well as those algorithms and hardware? There is a balance between patents and trade secrets. It's not a binary decision of whether we should only have patents or whether we should only have trade secrets. There certainly is a balance. There is a place for trade secrets, but we also need disclosures of the knowledge shared in those patent disclosures to spur innovation.
Let me add, I agree with everything that Elluru said. When we talk, we need to think about different types of intellectual property. Patents is just one type of intellectual property. Obviously, we have copyrights, trademarks, but for our purposes here for AI, patents probably the most important, as well as trade secrets. Those two are effectively the opposite of each other, more or less. There is a role for both of them, obviously, but patents incentivize public disclosure in exchange for a limited term of protection. Trade secrets is the exact opposite. It's a secret. You keep it closed within your company. So it is important to have both. For AI algorithms, it is important, in my view, to make sure that if new and novel, that the algorithm is subject to patenting in order, for the reasons that I said before, to incentivize investment in those algorithms, the creation of new ones, and the public disclosure of the algorithms. But to your point, Mr. Tucker, it's really important to also think about the data. There is actually no intellectual property meaningful. Let me put it this way. There's no meaningful intellectual property protection. There's no type of IP protection right now in the United States for the data sets that are so critical in training the machines for machine learning and the like. So companies, therefore, resort to pure trade secrets. It's like their crown jewels, right? This data, they keep it to themselves. And because of that, the big companies that have a lot of data can get bigger and they can get their machines to be bigger. It's really hard for the little ones, the startups, the new brand new innovators to penetrate that in order to access that data. So again, this is important in a free market economy because in centralized economies, you can dictate what to do with that data. We don't want to do that here. So here we need to think about new forms of intellectual property protection for this data, not necessarily a patent. Your question, not necessarily a patent. It could be some form of a patent, or it could potentially be a different type of protection for a much shorter period of time, perhaps with different incentives. But that's the type of discussion that needs to happen right away.
Let me follow up real quick. Could licensing and contractual arrangements fill part of the gap for data sets?
Sure. Voluntary licensing between companies, sure. But then if you're a big company, what's your incentive to license a startup who might compete with you? Having said that, the free market does allow for that to happen. And it does every now and then, but it's in an ad hoc way.
But if you had a patent or if you had some type of intellectual property wrapper around that data, don't you still have the same problem? Why would a big company make that data available to a startup? Why would it make it public?
You have different types of incentives.
Right. But you're going to get paid for it under a contract or a license. You would get, and you're going to be licensing the intellectual, if it was given IP protection.
So it depends how you do it, right? So I'll give you an example from the biopharmaceutical space. A drug has patents on the chemical formulation and all. But in addition to that, what drug companies have to do is to go through clinical trials that are very expensive and they generate a lot of data. There's a separate form of IP that protects that data from the clinical trial. Okay. Now, what do you do with that data? What do the pharmaceutical companies do with that data? It's protected for 5 years for small molecules, for example. Okay. But after 5 years, that data, which the FDA has, et cetera, can be used by generics in order to, at the right time, get their generic product to market quicker. Okay, so now that's separate and apart from any voluntary contracts between the branded drug company and the generic company. That is the operation of the law, a set of incentives, protection for 5 years, with the disclosure obligation at the end of that 5 years that benefits society overall. It's a win-win. Where you strike this balance, what incentives and what protections you have, that's a matter of public debate and negotiations. A similar, not identical, but similar concepts can be had for data sets in the AI world. It's different, I want to emphasize, than the pharmaceutical world. But it forms an example of what you can do with the data under the operation of law on top of and separate and apart from voluntary contracting opportunities.
Yeah, this is a critical issue. And in our very first hearing in Austin, we heard a lot of testimony about the challenge of a startup and the cost to a startup to obtain data. I've had the intellectual capacity to create a neat AI solution for something, but the data was so expensive. And figuring out a national policy around data availability with getting the incentives in a better balance appears to be a very foundational issue for making progress with AI innovation in this country. Otherwise, most of the innovation will come from big companies.
And that leads to stagnation and in the long run, because usually disruptive innovation happens from the edges. Yeah. And I want to emphasize the critical, urgent need for the country to address this in the face of competition from China. China is not as encumbered as we are with the laws of privacy and data use and the like, okay? And they have other ways in which they're sharing data internally there. And their advances in using the massive data that they have there to train their computer algorithms, their machine learning algorithms, far outpaces what we're doing here. And we need to overcome that gap in our own system, making sure that we respect our sensitivities and privacy laws and the like. That's why we need a legal mechanism.
Jerry, a couple of other folks looked like they were chomping at the bit to say something about that.
Yes.
literally jumping out of your chair. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Let me give that question, let me address that question with a simple use case. A simple use case for, let's take a startup that wants to be involved with actually providing storage for data. Okay, now the way that AWS does it, with the S3 service, which is a folder that it provides and it gives you a URL. And when you have that folder, you can put your stuff in there, but you have to pay because you have to have AWS account. But what about blockchain? In a blockchain scenario, that particular folder, we will have a protocol that works that will let anybody to provide that S3. And that is with a blockchain. You create a file system, the same file system that we used to have in IBM to let various nodes on the supercomputer communicate with each other and share that information by throwing that forecast data on many different storage. The same protocol that we developed, which is a lot of money that the US government spent with us to develop that. Now, it's simple matter. It becomes a priority of the US government. See that, oh, there are some of this protocol we can engage with university with that is expensive to develop, but when they exist, and that bottom layer is free for American companies, for us to be able to use, but any other layer on top of it for any other startup leveraging that protocol in order to have their own S3 folder to be able to sell, then it's become their new invention because it sits on top of what is already, the barrier of entry has been lowered by the state, which I think is the model that have always worked historically and which will continue to work. And so what we are seeing, the emerging of blockchain, is that some of this protocol that makes AWS hegemony and like that will be democratized and then give opportunity for peer-to-peer young startup to be able to have access. Include Western Union will no longer be in between. But for example, my daughter, I want to send some money to her in school. I'm already forcing them to have a wallet. She has a wallet. I have a wallet. On my Cash App, she will be able to, I would be able to just send the money to her, just like that peer-to-peer. So that is one way in which to, going back to your original question, which is which layer will be patented, which layer will not. All those kind of discussion, it have happened in many major labs. Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
Yes.
Go ahead.
As to data versus software versus hardware that needs to be protected, software and hardware have some sort of protection existing. Data does not have any meaningful protection now. So I would say of the 10 IP considerations that I referred to before, patent eligibility would be the #1 priority. And I would say data, IP protection for data, some type of IP protection for data would be the second.
If I could underscore that point, we actually undertook a survey of the public basically back in 2019, I believe, issued a report on sort of all the public views that they had regarding what forms of impacts AI had on the IP system. And that was one of the unresolved questions that we actually got back from the public. Sort of was, they were all over the place, right? Different views on, different things. But one of the things that emerged was that is something that we should look at further as USPTO is really investigate. What are we doing in terms of data protection laws in relation to AI systems? The other point I wanted to make was going back to sort of the tie between AI and IP is that to get this back to the first panel on regulatory side, I think it's important to recall that patents, the quid pro quo is the disclosure, right? So I think it goes some way that if we encourage patenting of AI systems, you actually add some value to the societal benefit of the patent and that you have some disclosure of what is actually being done rather than keeping it veiled in secrecy under a trade secret or something like that. So I think patent right actually provides some incentive, societal benefit and sort of seeing what an AI system is doing, and how it operates.
This panel is a bunch of superheroes. Great conversation, great testimony, great back and forth Q&A. Thanks, commissioners, and we did it on time. Thank you. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
You are excused. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to reconvene for our next panel. 5-minute break. We're going to jump into this panel. We have 4 witnesses on this panel. We are going to try to stay on schedule once again. We've done a good job so far. We're going to keep at it. First on this panel, according to my agenda, is Ili Baraktari from the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. Ili, floor is yours.
Thank you. Co-chairs Representative Delaney and Ferguson and commissioners of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Commission on AI Competitiveness, Inclusion and Innovation. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today on AI and national security. In case you don't know, from 2018 to 2021, I served as the executive director for the congressionally created National Security Commission on AI. Congress established an NSCI, the commission I led, in the fiscal year 2019 NDAA. The NSCI was an independent federal commission with a mandate to consider the means and methods necessary to advance the development of AI and associated technologies to comprehensively address U.S. national security. I'd like to emphasize to many audiences that we were not commissioned to look at AI for humanity or for economy. We were specifically looking at AI for the purposes of national security. The AI Commission was led by the former Google CEO, Dr. Eric Schmidt, and former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work. The Commission on AI, dissolved by statute last October per the Commission's congressional mandate. In March of 2021, we issued a comprehensive 759-page report that I'm going to leave with you that provides a blueprint and a strategy for the United States government to lead and win the global competition for AI and national security. To date, Congress has already moved to legislate more than 50 recommendations based on our report. Let me take this opportunity to provide a high-level overview of our main conclusions and recommendations before turning to my fellow commissioners to discuss certain topics in more depth. We reached a few overarching judgments. Number one, our government is not organized or resourced to win the technology competition against a committed competitor, or it is prepared to defend against AI-enabled threats. Number two, our nation must be AI ready by 2025 to defend and compete in the coming era of AI accelerated competition and conflict. We built the final report in 2 main parts. Part 1, Defending America in an AI Era, is about how the United States government can responsibly use AI technologies to protect the American people and our interests. It focuses on implications and applications of AI for defense and national security. Part 2, Winning the Technology Competition, recommends government actions to promote AI innovation, improve national competitiveness, and protect critical U.S. advantages in the larger strategic competition with China. There are 4 priority areas for our government action. Number 1 is leadership. We need organizational structures to accelerate the government's integration of AI and the government's promotion of AI across the country. This should include a Technology Competitiveness Council at the White House, and I can elaborate on that further. Second, talent. We have a huge talent deficit in government. We need to build new digital talent pipelines and expand existing programs. More broadly, we need to cultivate AI talent nationwide, and ensure that the world's best technologies come and stay in our country. Third, hardware. We're too dependent on semiconductor manufacturing in East Asia and Taiwan in particular. Most cutting-edge chips are produced at a single plant, separated by just 110 miles of water from our principal strategic competitor. That is unacceptable. We must revitalize U.S. cutting-edge semiconductor fabrication capabilities and implement a national microelectronics strategy. The goal should be to stay 2 generations ahead of China in the state-of-the-art microelectronics. Fourth, innovation. AI research will be very expensive. We need the government to help set the conditions for broad-based innovation across the country. That should include a national AI research and infrastructure. And we should reach $40 billion in annual funding in the next 5 years to cover AI R&D for defense and non-defense research. Finally, 2 themes cut across our report. The first is partnerships. We need to build coalition with like-minded nations to advance the development and use of AI and other emerging technologies in ways that support democratic values. Second is we need to do it in a responsible way. In the face of digital authoritarianism, the United States needs to present a democratic model of responsible use of AI for national security. Public trust will hinge on justified assurance that our government use of AI will respect privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights. We have a set of recommendations to help ensure that they're all in our book. Before I close, I'd like to take a moment to underline the importance of leading in AI for national security and put our final report and recommendations in perspective. The implications for our national security when China or any other authoritarian model sets the standards and rules for emerging technologies are rather severe. Who the leaders are in emerging technology also matters. Tech leadership means setting the rules for how they're used, controlling the infrastructure for their use, building the industries of the future, and fielding the best militaries to protect our societies. The first mover advantage in technology is enormous. It is important for our country to be in the lead of China because this is a values competition. We want these technologies to be developed according to our norms and ethics, which is the antithesis of how China is using it against their citizens through surveillance, oppression of their minority groups. When we don't have these democratic partnerships and dialogues, China moves ahead and sets the standards. 5G is a clear example of when we were absent from these forums and we didn't have an alternative approach to China. That is what happened. That's why China has set their standards on how we should use these technologies. I'm happy to go into more depth on any of these topic areas during our conversation. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Next on this panel will be Terry Roberts, founder and CEO of Whitehawk. Terry.
Thanks for having the hearing. Glad to be here. I come at artificial intelligence from a military intelligence graduate student of the 1980s, a Navy captain who ran scientific and technical intelligence for the Department of Navy, and led an intelligence community of interest of the first implementations of AI in the 1990s. An IC executive who ran the General Defense Intelligence Program, the Military Intelligence Program, and the former Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. I then went on to be the Executive Director of Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, an industry VP for cyber engineering and analytics, and then started my own company that is AI-based global cyber risk analytics online platform 6 years ago. When I entered the intelligence community in the early 1980s, we owned, drove, and advanced a huge sector of the computing power and data sets. This started to change in the 1990s, the dot-com and the World Wide Web. Still, I don't believe the national security arena fully understands that innovation in the data and analytics space is driven by global industry, R&D universities, and startups. That's where data and analytics innovation is born every day. I lived this transition, and I can tell you that I am still very engaged with our national security arena, and they don't get it. As you know, staying ahead of national security and global risk dynamics and issues is all about connecting the dots in order to tell us a complete story as possible and optimally provide decision advantage to key stakeholders, such as a warning of an impending event, analyzing or quantifying risk in order to mitigate it in near real time. AI-based algorithms and models are a means to do that, automated and at scale. As many have published, automated decision-making, ADM, involves the use of data, compute, and algorithms to make decisions across a broad range of contexts. Data from a range of sources such as databases, text, social media, sensors, images, speech, and the World Wide Web. While I have spent decades on global risk and national security, I want to focus today on the love of my career since 1998, cyber risk, resilience, and operations. In this arena, publicly available data sets are rich, broad, easily accessible, and very telling. As a cyber intelligence executive, I have seen capabilities dramatically advance over the past 20 years, and especially in the past 5 years, to where my company and our amazing partners and competitors can assess any legal organization in the world regarding their cyber threat landscape, key risks, maturity, compliance, and generate a foundational action plan mapped to solutions and best practices. And all I need is their legal name and URL. It is non-intrusive. This is the result of dramatic advancement of AI-based analytics across a global breadth of data sets across millions of businesses. It provides a 60 to 80% perspective of that company or organization, all automated and scalable and empowering for that company regardless of the level of cyber sophistication. And we know this because as a part of my business model, we have interacted with thousands of these companies after we run the assessment. So we have the ability to drill in and validate our findings in a unique way. In addition, 3 years ago, we conducted a proof of value across the US energy sector, 3,400 plus public and private entities, and demonstrated the power of placing AI-driven cyber risk management frameworks across an entire sector. The findings down to the individual entity level by region, subsector, or size. Frankly, it is the only way you will ever gain real insight into the risk and maturity profiles of 90% of all companies and organizations, because they don't have CIOs and CISOs. They don't have in-house expertise and resources. Last month, in fact, the Board of Governors of our Federal Reserve System put out a cyber risk monitoring market survey for implementation across 5,000 US financial institutions. This would be brilliant, cost-effective way to enable the resilience of all, where individual bank assessments can be shared directly with each bank and the portfolio trends can be shared with all, helping to prioritize initiatives and limited resources. And the portfolio analytics could be shared with the financial sector ISAP as a hacker view of their sector cyber risk and trends. One of the key limiters to achieving cyber resilience is adoption across all. These kind of methodologies could empower individual companies and organizations to own their cyber risk, share their cyber risk rating and reporting with others as they do business. In closing, a few challenges that I have encountered. The acceptance and mainstream integration by the US national security community of commercial best of breed risk analytics. Many of the companies are represented in this room, but in addition, companies like Graphica, Whitespace, Rain, Geolect, Interos, Black Kite. They are the mainstreaming commercial unclassified analytics and data sets that don't use national sources and methods, but can form the foundation for all of our national security analysis and assessments. 2, US and allied patent constructs for AI-based algorithms. Everybody was singing my song earlier. I have invested $2.5 million in R&D in our research and in our platform, and have been banging our head against the patent pending wall for several years now. And this is what we're told, that our algorithms save man years in time and effort, but don't optimize compute power. And as a result, we can't get the patent. That is, and happy to go into details at another time with all of the patent legal paperwork behind it. And then lastly, systemic protection of our most advanced algorithms from foreign adversaries. My entire career, I've had to think like a bad guy. I take for granted that every one of our commercial companies and all of their algorithms have been stolen by the Chinese. It's, it's cotton candy. They're not protected. So along with everything else we've discussed, I think we do need to discuss, are there some key jewels of the kingdom that have to be encrypted? You know, and what is the construct for doing that? So that we can truly protect what is giving us our analytic advantage in the national security arena. Look forward to your questions.
Terry, thank you. Next is Benjamin Harvey, founder and CEO of AI Squared.
All right. All right. So kind of looking around here, it's really an honor to be in a group of such amazing, prestigious individuals. So again, my name is Benjamin Harvey. I'm the founder and CEO of AI Squared. My company will be the first joint agency Credo, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement organization between the National Security Agency and the NGA, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, on trustworthy AI as well as AI integration. Okay. We are a Silicon Valley startup. We're top tier VC investments from New Enterprise Associates. We're on our way to Series A. We're kind of catchy, not there yet.
We'll talk later.
We've got customers and we partner with the likes of Microsoft, Salesforce, NVIDIA, Databricks, as well as contracts from DoD, JAIC, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. So our mission is really, and I'll talk about this in a second, but it's really to simplify and accelerate the path of integration into currently existing mission applications. So a little bit about my background. So I'm a three-time HBCU graduate, historically Black college and university. I have a PhD in computer science. I did my postgraduate research at Harvard, MIT. They have a joint program that's focused in health science technology, where I focused in on large-scale cancer genomics and applying machine learning algorithms to those types of data sets. I'm a professor at George Washington University, right down the street. And I'm also a appointed professor at Johns Hopkins University, where I helped build the COVID-19 risk tools that have been used by 3 to 4 million Americans. I worked for NSA for over a decade, as well as the CIA. My last two positions were the lead data scientist for the Edward Snowden leaks in an organization called the Media Leaks Task Force and the Corporate Disclosures Action Group. My final position was the Chief of Operations Data Science over at the National Security Agency. I ran an organization called the Operations Data Science Hub, and we really had two areas of our mission was to scale machine learning. So, think about machine learning algorithms running at scale across the large scale repositories of collection that's coming into the agency, but also the intelligence augmentation, right? So this is really, enabling not only the embedding of the machine learning results into the applications, but also making sure that the results are actionable, relevant, timely, and there's contextual information that's associated with it, so that when you have the intelligence analysts and the military warfighter that are using that data, they can report on it. It's effective for decision making. Okay, so I'll tell a little story. I think this is a really good opportunity to do this. So I've got two brothers, and I apologize if I get a little choked up here.
I'm not counting this against your time.
Yes, sir.
You're getting extra time.
One's a captain, and one is also a major in the U.S. Army. They were both deployed to a hostile Middle Eastern territories. And they both were affected by the deployments, both mentally and physically. And, all I could think about was when I was at NSA. I was the data science chief, and I couldn't get the results from our data scientists into the applications fast enough. And all I could imagine is if we would have been able to do that, we would have been able to, prevent some of the injuries and save lives, not only to my brothers, but to the other military warfighters that were in hostile territories. So when you think about the greatest challenges, I'll talk about them. And it's really a couple of things. So thank you, sir. For the analyst and the warfighter, it was really the inability to get models. So these are the results from the data scientists. So I had an organization of about 40 data scientists. So the challenge was getting the results of the models into the applications fast enough. So you could build the models, 90% of these models are sitting on the shelf and they're never making it into a mission production application, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have military warfighters and the intelligence community analysts that need to utilize the results of those machine learning algorithms, they couldn't get it fast enough because of the time and the cost that's associated with the integration. It's just too much on the organization in regards to the IT components to be able to get the results, instrument the applications, add the buttons, do the intelligence augmentation as needed in the application to make it actionable to relevant, contextualize the information. Because without the contextual information, without the explainability, the analysts won't trust the results and the results will never get into a report, right? So you're trying to go through the entire process from collection all the way through reporting to dissemination. They don't trust the results if they don't have it in the application that's in their workflows, right? So these are the applications that the analyst uses. They're 1, 2, or 3 applications, and that's all they use. So if you build a one-off capability that they have to jump outside of their workflows, they'll never use it, right? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the mission work that they do is it's extremely timely, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're focused on at AI Squared is figuring out how do we get the results of the machine learning models into the application, and also making sure that it's augmented in a way where it's ready for reporting. Okay. So you think about all the collect that comes in, right? There's SIGINT, there's OSINT, there's ELINT, there's FISINT, there's comment, communications intelligence. You're bringing that collection in, you're transforming it, and you're doing one of two things, right? You're building a machine learning model or you're building a rules engine. And a lot of times these rules engines are utilized because the OGC needs attribution, right? Because there could be catastrophic first, second order, third order effects if there's a bad decision that happens, okay? So, and then finally, what's very important is that there's kind of a couple of stages here. So there's a cost and time that's a challenge. The results that are embedded, the machine learning that's embedded in the application, it doesn't support decision making. That's another big one. And then the final thing is really the contextualization, like the background information. I call the why behind the KPI that the analyst needs in order to report against the intelligence that they're collecting. Okay. So how do we solve this last mile problem, right? So what our company is focused on is really reverse machine learning, right? So it's one thing to build these world-class models. What we've seen is that 90% of those models are sitting on the shelf, right? So then how do you reverse the process to take the results of the models or the models themselves to be able to get the results and transform them and map them in a way that they can be easily injected into the applications, okay? But it's also the intelligence augmentation. Like I said before, we had an analyst, she came to us, she said, she gave us 4 criteria. We live by this. You can ask my head of field engineering over there. If it's not actionable, if it's not relevant, if it's not timely, and if it doesn't have contextual information, she told me they won't report on it. Period. Right? And that means that there are people out there, right, in the field that aren't getting the intel that they need because of the inability of IT organization to provide it in a way that they feel they have trust, right, in what they're reporting on, right? So they need those 4 criteria. And that's really the intelligence augmentation. So it's how you need it, where you need it, the why behind the KBI, as well as making sure that it's timely. And then the last 2 things, so it's the value of the models. There's a huge emphasis on technical accuracy, but there's not an emphasis on the impact and value that the models are having across the organization, right? So if you understand the performance, but you don't understand the impact that it's having on the organization, you'll never increase AI adoption, right? So you'll never understand the level of engagement, the level of productivity, the usage of the AI capability across the organization, which is really important and is necessary for an organization to adopt the machine learning. And the last thing is the human machine teaming for trust, right? And this is the final recommendation. So we're focused on making sure that the tools are instrumented. And when I say instrumented, it's the implicit and explicit behavior of the end users in the applications, right? So that you can understand that. And then as they're creating the data, as far as the usage, you're reporting that back to the data teams so that they can update the performance, but they can also tell the organization how impactful and how valuable the models really are. And it enables the organization to focus investments, because if you understand the impact, you can focus the investment on the model and say, hey, we need to scale this. Otherwise, what I've seen is that there's a lot of top-down identification of machine learning capabilities that need to be used, but you need to hear it from a bottom-up perspective. You need to hear from the organization what's important. So if you instrument the tools, it gives you a better understanding of the level of engagement, the productivity, the usage of the capability, and that can inform investments for the organization. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Important, powerful stories and examples for us. Last on this panel is Brian Drake, the Federal Chief Technology Officer at Accrete AI Government. When Brian is done, we're going to have some time for questions for this panel. Some of our commissioners I know haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, so I'm going to try and prioritize you if you haven't asked a question yet. So get ready or be prepared if you want. Brian.
Thank you so much. So I'm Brian Drake. I just left a 10-year career at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I ran a number of AI projects while I was there. I was an analyst first and foremost, so I worked counterintelligence, counter-narcotics, counterterrorism, and emerging and disruptive technologies. I did that for a majority of my career. 2 of those years I spent as a director of artificial intelligence at DIA. I ran a $20 million portfolio, encountering many of the challenges that Ben just described, and trying to transition technology to folks that actually needed to do the mission. And then the last year of my time at DIA, I was running the briefing team in the Pentagon for the Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary, Undersecretaries of Defense, and other E-ring principles. So I am also equally humbled to be here today. I really thank the Commission for the invitation, and I hope I have a message that resonates. And I really just have 2 things I want to share. The first is that when we think about this space from a national security perspective, at least when I think about it, I think it is a full spectrum attack on our country. I think it is an unrelenting deluge of activity against our most precious assets. Thank you. And when I think about it that way, it makes the second point that I wish to make clearer. If we do nothing, we risk losing our economic and national security competitiveness across the board, without question. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So when I talk about a full spectrum attack, what am I talking about? I'm talking about all the instruments of national power from our adversaries being directed at all of our national security instruments and economic power centers. That means their intelligence apparatuses. That means their direct and indirect funding apparatuses. That means their commercial and military integration activities. All of those are being directed toward artificial intelligence. And make no mistake, it is about winning the future war. That is all they care about. So from that departure point, I want to drill into those three areas. The first is I want to talk about intelligence. So when we think about China and Russia, they have three primary ways they go about doing that. The first is they use economic espionage. They use folks on the inside. They try to steal traditional human tradecraft. That happens all the time. They also use a fair amount of cyber theft. And Terry was one of the examples of attacks. Sure. Yeah.
No, I was just, there's a cybersecurity.
If you are joining us virtually, I just ask if you keep yourself on mute until we perhaps recognize you, just so we can, we're getting some feedback here in the main conference room. So thanks very much for keeping yourselves on mute for now. Thank you.
So when we talk about cyber theft, I want to use a case example. Cyber Reason, which is a cybersecurity company based out of Boston, they did a study on something they called Operation Cuckoo Bees, can't make it up, and looking at an attack that occurred from 2019 to 2022 by what we think is a Chinese cyber activity called APT41. They discovered that there were hundreds of gigabytes of data being stolen from North America, Europe, and Asia. That data included things like intellectual property, blueprints, diagrams, formulas, all things that we could be using for national security apparatuses, all of which were under consideration for patent or pre-patent. Right? They estimate, and it's hard to understand kind of how much we're talking about because it is patented technology, so it's a future projection. But they estimate that we're looking at about $225 to $600 billion of wealth gone in 2-3 years of activity. This is one example of what General Alexander describes as the largest transfer of human wealth in history. And it's all going to China. Okay, that's just one example. Here's an interesting coincidence. In 2019, China surpassed the United States in international patent filing, according to the World International Intellectual Property Organization. And even at the height of COVID, when everybody was home, in a country that was quarantined and arguably more grossly affected than most countries on the planet, they surpassed our lead again by 17%. How is that possible? I have a clue. I think it's because they're stealing our intellectual property and doing a copy paste into the patent system. Now, those patents haven't been legally challenged. I'm sure our counselors that were here before would probably say there's a long road to hoe. It doesn't matter. They have primacy and prime mover advantage. So in a court of law, they can continue to infringe on all of that intellectual property. They can continue to issue technology without restraint. And our industry falls behind. So I absolutely echo the AI's recommendation that we need to treat intellectual property as a national security asset. Second thing I want to talk about is direct and indirect funding. From 2010 to 2019, one of our competitors called Gavini did a study of supply chains across the Department of Defense. They estimate that over that period of time, there was a 420% increase in Chinese investment in the DoD supply chain. That means that they are starting to put their tentacles into apparatuses that are not just what we're doing in pre-design, but actually at the manufacturing end. So they can't steal it, they will change it at the back end to affect battlefield operations. That comes through lots of different ways. One of the primary ways is through venture capital money. Then they get that venture capital money on the table, that allows them to get access to intellectual property, seat board members, have sway over corporate strategy, and it has a direct effect on what we do in government. Now, I speak from personal experience, working with a lot of Silicon Valley units out of the Defense Intelligence Unit. When we found a company through vetting that had some sort of degree of Chinese venture capital, we walked away. We walked away because we knew that that encumbered us with other headaches, concerns that we wouldn't be able to overcome. That is a strategic win for the competitor. That means I, as a government buyer, can no longer go and get access to that technology because it's already in the hands of the Chinese, or at least it's safe to assume it is. So what is our competitive advantage in that? And let me tell you, that investment was $100,000. Pocket change, but we have to take it seriously. Okay. Third thing, civil military integration. This is not a new phenomenon. The Chinese government, the Russian government, our government is integrating very tightly with our military apparatus, right? our defense contractors, of course, make a lot of our technology. The only reason I raise it is because China and Russia's rules around this are much more fluid. It's a bigger gray space. We have rules, we have contract processes, we have budget authorizations and then appropriations. We know where that money goes. We know how it gets directed around. We don't understand that fully in China and Russia. It moves very fluidly. So you might have a company that has a joint venture with a US company, and you might see IP move right across this transom, going right into a technology defense area application. That is particularly acute in artificial intelligence. And why we need to pay attention to it is because what we are seeing is artificial intelligence technologies transiting not just intelligence processes that we're doing in NSA, but lethal systems. They don't care about having a person in the loop to make a lethal decision. We care about that. They're deriving competitive advantage by taking that person out of the loop and being able to combat war faster than we can. And that's an ethical issue for us. We will not, I hope, we will not take a person out of that lethal loop. I hope I never see that. Our adversaries don't care about that. These are people that bomb hospitals. Okay. So I worry about joint ventures. I worry about where that money comes from. I also worry about the rise in strategic doctrine and academic literature about the degree to which AI integration is occurring. There's three things I want to talk about in terms of actions I think that are within our realm.
Ryan, if I could just ask you to summarize it quickly.
Very fast. So first is outreach. I think that there are a lot of folks in industry who are on the cutting edge, especially small businesses in the Valley. They don't understand what we're talking about. Like even to start talking about, hey, you need to think about where your money comes from. That's a very unusual conversation. They won't understand it. Primarily because if someone comes to you and says, I have $3 million I'm ready to give to you, you don't ask a lot of questions if you have to make payroll next week. So we have to think about that. And I would say you should focus on something like the FBI's Office of Private Sector. They have a mission to do outreach, but most of it is focused on counterterrorism and like national events like NASCAR and Super Bowl. You probably want to broaden that to focus more on intellectual property protection, white collar crime. Second thing is education. I think we need to stop pretending that the Thousands of Talents program is some sort of economic program for the Chinese. It is a veiled, not even veiled. It is an open program to take our talent from the United States, cultivated in our universities, and move it back to China. That means we need to have a series of changes around how we think about granting student visas and who comes back. I've already talked about venture capital money, but there is an initiative in the DoD called the Trusted Capital Digital Marketplace, which allows VCs to lobby for access to become a certified venture capital provider to DoD systems, and that has a degree of trust, kind of this underwriter's laboratory trust kind of stamp. I think that should be expanded across the whole government. Last is, this is our opportunity to punch back. If we are not investing in programs that kick China in the teeth, I don't know what we're doing. I just don't know. That's how they're thinking about it. We should be thinking about it the same way, which means we need to change our immigration rules and get the most talented folks they have who come over here to get training and get education and keep them here. Do not kick them out. Do not send them back. It also means we need to better protect things like our dissertations that are sitting on shelves where they get copied by foreign nationals and then sent abroad. Last part is, I think we should empower industry to partner better with government to go after our adversaries. Industry is the first canary in the coal mine to know when something bad has happened, whether that's a person that they found out was working for the other side or whether there's a cyber attack against their infrastructure. Industry will know first, but we're not allowed, we're very, very limited in our ability to affect that nefarious actor. Thank you for the time.
Right, thank you. Thank you to this whole panel. Are you chance to ask a question?
No, I got plenty.
Okay,
So
go ahead. Hit it first.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just thank you for a great panel. I almost wish we could spend like the whole afternoon on just this. So I guess I'll just kind of have two questions. One would be for you, Illy. The PDF was, impressive enough. The physical copy is downright daunting. For bringing it with you. As you mentioned, I think Congress has taken up something like 50 recommendations. There's now that we're kind of a year out from when it was released. I'd be curious to hear from you, just like, what are the recommendations, if you had to prioritize them, that haven't really been addressed yet, that you see as still kind of low hanging fruit? And then the other question for the rest of the panel, I think one of the common denominators among all of the experiences you've had is this issue of integration of a kind of a startup company in the private sector trying to interface with the government. of the difficulties and bottlenecks there, which of those are kind of policy or regulatory that kind of we could offer, suggestions about how to ameliorate, or if it's kind of investment, or, what is the pain point that I think is most central and that needs to be resolved? So,
Like working for the government?
yeah. Like we have great private sector kind of startups and, as you're trying to interface with the government, what are the pain points that make that?
Probably the best.
Keely, go ahead first.
Yeah. Chris, thanks a lot. Thanks for all the support you provided in Brookings during the NSCI days. I would say 3 recommendations that I highly think we need to prioritize in the next fiscal year would be, number 1 is Brian really depicted the whole competition with China in a way that I also indicated in my opening remarks. We're not organized or resourced to go after this competitor. And so this has to come from the top. And so when I say it has to come to the top, it has to come from the White House. After World War II, we created the National Security Council because the Soviet Union, and particularly the security, was the primary threat we faced from Soviet Union. After the Cold War, we created the National Economic Council because economy became the centerpiece of our competition. I believe technology is the center of competition. AI is fundamentally the center of that technology. And if we don't place it at the highest levels of our government, we will still not be organized. Every department and agency will do their own thing, but we will not have that coordinated approach and organizational structure to go after a competitor that Brian really depicts so well. So that's one is TCC, Technology Competitiveness Council. It's bigger than just folding it, Chris, under NDAA. We were tasked by NDAA, so this is a bigger recommendation. The second one, the two other ones are really related to people. Again, our advantage over China are people. How do we create a talent pipeline for our federal government to have access to these technologies really matters. Because at the end of the day, how we get organized, how our military operates, how our intelligence community operates really depend on how fast we bring these technologies to help our military. So 2 recommendations to that end. Number 1 is we recommended creating the U.S. Digital Service Academy. All the military academies have their own educational systems. Our federal government doesn't have access to any kind of academy where they can hire talent right out of college and keep them for 5 years until they pay back their time. So creating a civil service academy that are focused on educating young people on technologies is a fundamental thing. We have to get it right. And then the last piece is we recommended creating the National Digital Reserve Corps. All the military services have a reserve corps. We talk to a lot of technologists in Silicon Valley. A lot of them want to help our government, but they don't want to leave their private sector jobs. So what is a middle way you can create for them? You create a reserve program where they offer 2 weeks a year to our government, their services. And this will allow you to have high-end access to the best technologies, people that don't want to leave Apple or Google or Facebook, but they want to help HHS. They want to help Commerce or DoD for that matter. So creating a civilian digital reserve corps would be my 3rd biggest item that I would like to move in the next fiscal year, because these 3 ideas will really get us aligned and organized towards this competition that Brian really spoke really well about.
If I could talk to the federal government, national security, procurement and contracting albatross, right? It was designed for contracting in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. That flip I told you about, where computing and technology is driven by commercial industry and R&D universities, you have to spend millions to know what's going on in the national security arena, from a requirements, request for information, market surveys, request for proposals. Even someone who ran a $21 billion program, right? Okay, in my last company, I had a $45 million budget focused on knowing what the heck was going on in the national security arena. Who's paying for that? The US government. How stupid is that? So many of these requirements are ubiquitous. So you could, if there was a consistent way to get out those requests for information, market surveys, requests for proposals, more OTAs, other transaction authorities that are quick turn, then commercial companies could play in that mix, and they don't need to know who's asking for it, right? It could be CIA or it could be the IRS, right? It doesn't matter. Opening that up would change the dynamic of federal government access to commercial innovation and save billions of dollars in business development and sales BS time. I don't feel strongly about it.
Comment on
I remember Ben some airtime because he's in the middle of it right now. The only thing this is just my opinion. I'm not a big fan of procurement reform. I think our contracting, I started in contracting, it's my first federal job. I think contract specialists, contract officers have every instrument they need to access industry. It is not a question of the rules. It is a question of the right person in the right place saying yes. And it's not just the contracting officers, also the GCs, the lawyers, guys. Like they have to be in a position to say, this is in the interest of the US government, here's why. And they have to be well conversant in that. I think a business advocate inside of agencies would help. I think that is one of the, I was in an innovation shop at DIA, and they would always kind of cock their head and look at you strangely when you say, well, I think that's not in the interest of business, whatever the decision is. And then these are our partners. Like, we don't succeed without them. And that was a very different view than most things in the agency held. I don't know what your experience was.
Yeah. And so I see really two core areas. One is you think about people in a sense, right? So a lot of, investors, right, that are not focused on investing in dual purpose technologies, right? So these are technologies that will provide value for industry as well as the federal government. They will not let you focus on the federal space until you hit 50 to 100 million ARR. You just can't, because the time it takes to get a relationship in the federal government all the way through to working through the policy, the compliance, the governance, the security, all those elements, you will burn so much cash that you will not be able to survive, right? The opportunity with a company like myself is a cooperative research and development agreement, which is a research contract with the National Security Agency and NGA, right? So literally, and our investors, our flavor, we come from federal government, so they understand we're coming into the startup game as a dual purpose technology. So they have more leeway for us to work with the federal government to burn cash servicing federal government needs. But the challenge is really getting through those hurdles of the technology processes to get the tech inside of the door. But you also need the champions on the federal side. So the Credo for us is a way to engage. We've got the lead for trustworthy AI from the agency on our research team, right? Same thing on the NGA side. So it's an opportunity to kind of understand the needs of the agency, to incubate your technology in a way that it could service and address those needs. But it also provides that pathway to integration because you're working through policy compliance, governance, security challenges as you're incubating your technology.
Shankar, we've got time for one more question from you.
Great. Of questions, but I want to take it back to a little basic level. If I connect the dots between this session and the earlier sessions argued that if you cannot make the data available, so AI is on top of data. If you cannot make the data available to a lot of people, the innovation is going to be solved. So that's a very strong argument. On the other hand, you're walking in here and saying, hey, data is on national security. You have to be really tight about where the data goes. Sitting on this side of the table, how do you find the right balance in driving innovation by making data more available to those who want to innovate versus how do you balance that against national security? Your thoughts?
So publicly available data today is 100-fold of compared to national sensitive sources and methods data, right? So what I was trying to get across in my original discussion is start with that publicly available global risk data because it's 100-fold of what we can acquire in the national security system. So that should be open. But then once you have sensitive sources and methods data sets, right? And maybe when you commingle the two, then that has to be protected for national security reasons.
So you're basically arguing that we need to look at data sources, call them public, completely made available, including China, by the way. Once you open it, it's gone. And then identify across the board in the country. When I say across the board, private sector, the banks where I belong to right now, banking data to the public services data, everything that's national security industry protectors, you're targeted along the way. That's what I'm getting from.
I believe so.
Got it. Any other
But,
thoughts?
but please, other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that data's, so understand, I'm coming from a perspective that was about combat effectiveness.
I know they come.
So when I think about this type of issue,
Yep.
I think of data as a battle space.
It is.
I think that there is competitive advantage in which we derive from having access to data, and there is competitive advantage we derive by denying access to data. So, and I'm primarily thinking about the egalitarian ethical thing to do would be to democratize data and let everybody see it. My opinion is that you are not entering into that game with an ethical and fair player. That player is going to do things like repress their own people with that information. And so I believe it's in the interest of the United States government not to be a party to that activity. I think we should be blaming and shaming our adversaries for doing things that we find immoral or unethical. And we should be taking that high ground. And I'll tack on top of that. We have friends. They don't. We need to be more tightly coupled with our Five Eyes partners, our partners in Africa, our partners in India, our partners in Eastern Europe. And we need to get innovator partners, of course. We need to be more acceptant of the advantage we derive by allying against our adversaries. We do not do an effective job of this. I'll illustrate one point. Where is China focusing the most activity in terms of international development? Not a stump the chump question. It's Africa.
Africa. Yeah, forever.
We have a body now in the CDAO, used to be the JAG, that organizes our international competition on AI and includes some of the countries and areas I mentioned. The only continent not included is Africa and Antarctica. Why are we ceding, or at least what our adversary views as the most important strategic battlegrounds for them, to them?
We're going to have to wrap. Fabulous panel. Thank you all so much for both your testimony here, but also for all of your work outside of these rooms. So thank you for spending time with us today. First up on this panel, our fourth and final panel of the day, Colin Carroll, the Director of Applied Innovation.
Thanks.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks for the opportunity to testify today, guys. You don't know me. I'll start by saying I'm not a policy person, right? I'm an engineer. I found myself serving in the Marine Corps, and then I was a senior executive at the Joint AI Center, which I mentioned, which by the way is not doing any kind of international competition. I ran Project Maven, which some of you guys may have heard about, some in the news. I ran an autonomy program for the OSD, a SAT program called Smart Sensor. Then I left just recently as the head of development for the Joint AI Center. Now in industry, I run the government team at Applied Intuition. We're an autonomy company, VC-backed small business in Silicon Valley, and we're here in the DC office. My approach to the nexus of industry, AI, and national security stems from my observations over the last 6 years, both in government and now out of government. So lots of words have been spoken and written about AI and national security. I brought my hard copy version of Ely's final report there. 700 plus pages, 340 recommendations. I'm not going to try and summarize. Ely did a really good job summarizing his findings. I think I'm going to try and focus on an issue that I'll say is like big N national security, i.e. resulting in like big P policy, which is required in order to set the stage for like the next 30 years of American national security. So I think since we're all here and you guys invited everybody, like, well, it's safe to assume that we all think AI is important and relative to national security is critical. not just by itself, but also in the form of its like applied use, which is really automated systems and autonomous systems. I think it's going to continue to revolutionize industry and military operations. And I think that we probably would agree that the nation that best capitalizes on the employment of the applied uses of AI will be most positioned to optimize its domestic workforce, deter aggression, and then dominate in conflict if we ever get to that point. I think there's an underlying truth that kind of came out in the earlier panel. I'm going to explicitly state it here. So in software technology in general, and in AI software in particular, it is industry and not the Department of Defense, the research institutions that are really leading, driving innovation. I think specifically that's Silicon Valley and its offshoots in a couple other places in the country. The DoD research enterprise plays a role, but it's not the tip of the spear like it was 30, 40 years ago. And so what does that kind of mean for the US? I look at like this in kind of three building blocks. So on one side, you have talent. I'm not talking about talent like in the Department of Defense. I'm talking about, broadly speaking, the talent pool of technical people in America. I think there's technology development, which is really the tech itself, plus the investment required to build it. And I think there's how do you get the technology into the Department of Defense? Now, like I could literally spend all day talking about the last point about acquisitions reform. And I completely agree with Brian when he says that contracting officers have every tool. Congress has authorized us to do exactly what we need to do in the Department of Defense. We just have people that they're not educated, they don't know, or they're scared. So I'm going to focus on the first area, which I think is like the foundational component to this whole thing, right? If we don't have the right people, then everything falls apart. We can talk about like fixing microelectronics or acquisition reform or creating more bureaucratic leadership structures, investing $40 billion. I can tell you, like, if you gave my company $500 million a year, said go fix AI for national security, but we didn't have the talent, it would be completely irrelevant and not worth our time. So the nation, like any team organization, succeeds or fails based on the people who are in it. For those of you guys who know me from my DoD days, know that I say people are the most important thing, hands down, in any organization. The bottom line is our national security depends on our ability to attract, nurture, and retain technical talent. And without this talent pool as a foundation, everything else is kind of irrelevant. It's a technical field, it's math and computer science, right? It's software engineering. And so not everybody wants to do that. And some of the people that want to do it aren't going to become world-class at it, especially here in America. Talent is fluid. It'll shift locations based on, really, I see it's three things, right? So education, job opportunities, and quality of life. So I think we, the United States, need to provide these things better than other places in the world in order to sustain that talent here. So that means tackling the third real topic of immigration reform. So I heard someone say, I think it was Brian said earlier about like restricting student visas. I mean, he said in one sentence, restricting student visas. The next sentence he said, but we need to, have better immigration reform. Let me tell you what, like people come here to go to school. Why? Because we have the best institutions with the best instructors, and we're incentivized by grants from the federal government. That's why they come. That's how they get here to start on the whole. Then they go on and they get a 4H visa. They work, and they end up having to go back a lot of times. I know my company experiences this right now. Most of the work that we do is commercially focused in the autonomy industry. It's not defense focused. I'd say half of our small business is probably foreign nationals. Okay. And they end up going back to where they came from, which is unfortunate. I think we still in America have world-class instructors. We still have the cachet at schools like MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, their centers of AI innovation. I do think if we restrict this talent pool, and there's all sorts of people writing and talking about this, talent's going to go somewhere else studying research, then the instructors will follow, and then the grants will follow. Everybody wants to supervise the best researchers and best academic students, and that's what's going to happen. So I think, if we enact nativist immigration policies or even the status quo that we have now, I really do predict that by the end of the decade, the transition of the AI education and research power base to basically China and India, that'll be complete, and it's going to be really, really hard, if not impossible, to overcome that. I think the nativist policies that restrict workers is the same issue. So in Silicon Valley, foreign work is what we survive and thrive on. Like Silicon Valley would not exist if it was just, guys named Colin Carroll graduating from wherever and trying to work in Silicon Valley as a software engineer. It's not accurate. My fiance, she emigrated from Ukraine at age 17. She's now a technical PM for Azure Federal for Microsoft. My CEO emigrated here from Pakistan when he was 5 years old. He managed a multi-billion dollar unicorn startup that's really driving innovation in the autonomy sector. These are just two anecdotes. I don't have like an army of researchers or, like binders and statistics. I didn't do any Googling here, but I do think my observations will be backed up in fact. I think the bottom line, I'll just kind of end this way. The bottom line is that we need immigration reform, ideally bipartisan, that prioritizes incentives for foreign talent to attend school, to conduct research, to work here, and to become really U.S. citizens. I think a lot of the I don't call it fear mongering, but a lot of because it is true, right? I mean, there are students that come here, there are workers that come here, and they leave with their IP, they go back to where they came from. They either go to a foreign company, or they go to state-owned enterprise, or they go back to an intelligence service, and they give our IP away. That is a massive problem. I think the solutions to this problem are probably more counterintuitive, definitely controversial than people think. And it's really how to incentivize people to stay here as a citizen. And it might involve policies like the family plan for citizenship, right? Which is get the leverage that China, for example, has over a student or a worker's family and just eliminate that leverage. Because a lot of times that's why people go back. There's a whole other reasons about quality of life and kind of like America that are policy problems. But I think in general, most people would say it's better here than it is other places on the planet. So I'll just end by saying this. I think that we need bipartisan immigration solutions now with respect to tech talent. You guys, I don't know, maybe not, maybe I'll age myself here, but you get the dog in the house fire meme. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, where the dog's like, everything is fine. Like, to me, we're at that moment right now. We just might not do it. And my biggest fear as a taxpayer is like waking up, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, and it's too late to recover this. My big fear is a company as well, right? We want to continue growing. We're 350 people. We want to be 650 people in the next year. So I appreciate the time. Thanks, everybody.
Colin, thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Sean Gorley, founder and CEO of Primer.ai. Sean.
Hey, thanks, everyone. And thank you for putting this session together and for the speakers that are joining me today. I think there's, obviously been a huge amount of discussion about the impact that AI is going to have, but I think we've actually underestimated massively the impact that it's going to have in the world of warfare. And I think the biggest impact actually that artificial intelligence will have in the next decade will be in the world of defense and intelligence. And the reason for that, I think, is what we're looking at with artificial intelligence is really what's known as the third offset. The first two offsets being nuclear weapons and stealth weaponry, right? Where an offset in conflict renders a side that doesn't have this technology effectively obsolete. So when we sit here now, I think it's important to kind of look back at the last two offsets. Nuclear weapons ended the Second World War, and precision-guided munitions and stealth weaponry rendered the US against the sixth largest army at the time, the Iraq army, rendered the conflict over in about 72 hours. So as we look at this, my position is that artificial intelligence will actually have a bigger impact than those two combined. So as we look through this, is not a hypothetical discussion. This is not something that will happen in the future. We are already seeing artificial intelligence play out today on the battlefield in Ukraine. And this is something that's really emerged from the ground up. It's people sticking computer vision on top of homemade drones with homemade grenades, looking for image classification of camouflage vehicles and dropping bombs on them. It's artificial intelligence listening to all the radio transcriptions, combining this with object detection and social media videos, and obtaining real-time information about the exact movements of Russian troops. And of course, the impact that artificial intelligence is having today on a very, very important part of information operations, the battle for the hearts and minds of the different populations, the manipulation thereof. So we're seeing that here today, and it's important to recognize that Russia nor Ukraine are either AI superpowers. China is an AI superpower, and that is where we are going to be very much in an arms race for this next decade. And as we go back to this being the third offset, the winner of this arms race will determine the geopolitical landscape of the world we're in. It's that serious. So as we look at this, I think part of this is to come down and say, well, what actually are we sitting at, right? And I think, look, the United States and its allies have huge advantages today, but this is not going to be one on the advantages we have today. It's going to be one on the speed that we move. And China is moving very, very quickly. We talk about AI in the abstract, but I think we should talk about it in the components that make up. And for me, I like to frame this with 4 different components. The first of these is the algorithms. It's the neural nets that we're very familiar with. It's where a lot of our focus goes. But there's 3 other components. It's also the computing resources. And it's the training data these systems are trained on top of. And finally, it's the deployment that we can put these things into actually the hands of our warfighters. So let's start with the first of these ones. And algorithms really, I think the US does have a clear advantage. I think our friend here talked about the power of the research institutions, the power of the R&D labs that our companies have. But again, that is changing quickly. When I started Primus 6 years ago, we'd pick up research papers and about 1 or 2% of those would be from Chinese institutions. Fast forward today, the research papers that we take that have significant results that we use to look at commercialization, about 20% of those now come from Chinese institutions. They are moving quickly. So we've got the advantage, but China is closing. And the second component, which is computing power, right? The computing power that drives and trains these algorithms. This is largely graphics processing units and GPUs. The US and Taiwanese companies dominate the space at the moment. Indeed, China has massive issues here. Only about 1 in 20 of the chips that they consume internally are produced internally. So they have to import those chips. This brings Taiwan very much into the front and center of the space. Taiwan, if you don't know, produces 92% of all the advanced processing chips in the world. And if China were to take Taiwan, it would leapfrog forward in its capabilities to produce things, or at the very least, it would render our ability to utilize those chips and put that at a significant disadvantage. So we're going to see a battle for chips, and I think it's best to consider this. You would never start a war previously without energy independence. We're never going to start a war in the future without compute independence. The third is data, and we talk a lot about data, but I want to get very precise on this, specifically human labeled data. It's the data that has been labeled by humans that allows computer vision algorithms to determine whether or not it's a tank or a missile launcher to function. These are subject matter experts that are literally drawing boxes around different objects by the tens of thousands and allowing the computer to know what they know so the computer can operate at a scale and speed that they can't. Now, as you look at this, the labeling capacity is actually huge because it takes tens of thousands of labels to make these systems work. When you look at that, it's also crucial to have this labeling on tap because whatever algorithm you go into a conflict with, your opponent is going to try and deceive that. We're already seeing experiments with China painting tanks yellow and black to try and confuse them to make them look like construction vehicles. These are adversarial opponents that are looking to defeat the AIs that we're bringing to the table. So it's not just about labeling, it's about having that labeling on tap and ready to train algorithms quickly so that the system can learn from that. China has a huge advantage here. They've already got a massive army, the 50-cent army of people that are there basically determining whether or not things are should be censored. They can be very easily repurposed to train algorithms, and they are. And the final bit of this is actually, I think, the most important. And that's the deployment of artificial intelligence. The deployment of artificial intelligence. And so you can have all the advantages of compute, data, people, but if you don't deploy the AI, then it's of no use. The deployment is crucial. Getting into the hands of the soldiers, the analysts, the operators is really what we hear about. And the reality is we're in a world where the procurement cycle of that has got all sorts of problems. The speed of that is the major problem. And whilst the 3-year procurement cycle for a new jet fighter may be fine, a 3-year procurement cycle for a new AI system renders the system that you put in place obsolete by the fact that it's 3 years old. The system moves so quickly that in 3 weeks you can be out of date. And if we can't move faster than 3 years in procurement, we are going to be fielding AI that is obsolete. And that just is not going to be acceptable given the importance of the space that we're in. So the speed to deployment is crucial. And there's bits of that where you see as a company that are just incredibly frustrating. You can go through this and you're seeing just archaic regulations and you're wondering why do these things exist? You're also seeing a procurement cycle that is longer than the runway of the startups that are supposed to be going after it. If you're a young, innovative machine learning company, you can literally solve anything in the world. People will pay you to solve any problem. You're going to come in and say, oh, we're going to solve the defense problem, but it might take you 3 years. You say, I don't have 3 years of time. I've got 2 years and I've got to show progress before I can get my Series B, C, or D. So the deck is just literally stacked for insiders. It's stacked for the big contractors and the primes that have the time and the space to navigate these bureaucratic regimes, can wait out the contracting process, and ultimately are putting in a place where they sprinkle a few buzzwords in an application, they pick up the dollars because they were the ones that were there. We need to make this more accessible for the best and the brightest minds and make this something that our technology companies want to be part of.
Sean, could I just ask you to summarize?
Yeah, and so I'll summarize here. Look, we're ahead in people, which is good, and the algorithms that go with that. I think China has the advantage when it comes to labeling. We're ahead when it comes to the GPUs and the chips. But I think we're behind when it comes to the deployment, which is the most important piece of this. So at 2-2, I think we need to do a lot better because it's not a race that we can end up losing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Ryan Lewis, partner at SRI Ventures.
I'd like to thank the members of the Commission and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. So my name is Ryan. I'm a partner at SRI Ventures. That's the corporate venture arm of SRI International. For those of you that may have heard of it, but maybe isn't as a fresh memory, SRI, which is former Stanford Research Institute, it's a nonprofit organization that focuses on advanced R&D for public and private sector use cases. Since our founding in 1946, we've been involved in creating a wide variety of Silicon Valley innovations, including the computer mouse, which people at the office still mock me for using. I'm powerless without it here. Our ARPANET, and more recently Siri, which is now Apple's virtual assistant. We have about 1,700 researchers and scientists that conduct about 1,000 projects a year ranging from biosciences to computer science. On the venture side, we specialize in commercializing deep tech innovations that come out of the lab. Majorities, if you look at our portfolio, are AI ML technology. Right, and the side it takes the form of creating new companies and building entrepreneurs and venture capital around that, or transferring IP into existing startups. For my comments today, I'd like to consider how, in some ways, and we've hit a little bit on it already, the old has become new again. And I'm not referencing Tom Cruise in the new Top Gun movie. Great movie. More appropriately, I'm referencing the challenges associated with reforming our policies and strategies to better leverage dual-use technology. As early as the 1980s, Jack Gensler, who was an executive at the Pentagon and went on to lead acquisitions under the Clinton administration, he wrote, and quote, we have to find and implement ways to strengthen the U.S. economy through dual-use investments in security and economic growth, end quote. Right, that was over 40 years ago, and this topic came to mind. And the problem that he was thinking about wasn't AI, but it was similar today, where he saw a majority of innovations that were occurring that could help leverage the defense industrial base happening in the commercial sector. And what's interesting enough is in the NSC AI final report, it identified AI as the quintessential dual-use technology. And so while the disruptive effects of what we've been talking about today are perhaps new, right, in the American experience, the strategies and challenge, or the strategies and techniques that maybe we use to resolve them are not. And perhaps we can leverage some lessons learned from the past. And so to perhaps help realize this, I'd like to offer 3 considerations. Point number 1 is we should work to leverage some of our existing R&D and mission programs in both the DoD and the IC. A lot has changed since AlexNet won ImageNet in 2012. I remember when I was working at InQtel and we first proposed to launch an open source computer vision lab. This was tied closely with some of our members in the IC in terms like training data volumes, data labeling schemas, evaluation metrics were not a term of art, right? Outside of like a couple core groups. Now they're mainstream lexicon. Whether or not they're being executed in the best way, the best or most efficient way, that's a different story. But the concepts are there and some of the program funding is there, right? Our goals initially when just launching the lab were more modest. Introduce these core concepts to practitioners, see what fits, and start building relationships. Today, the environment is much different. On the one end of the spectrum, we have numerous multi-million-dollar programs focused on deploying AI capabilities at scale, right? R&D and commercial needs from these end users and programs include making these systems more cost efficient, optimizing them for performance against different use cases, integrating them with existing toolkits, because how many times have I heard analysts don't want another UI to look at data, and harden them against adversarial perturbations. These programs, which are already funded, already working, for better or for worse, right, should have the flexibility to experiment with best of breed solutions, whether they derive from current providers, i.e. the contract winner or the subcontractors under that, or they're completely new entrants, right, that have some best of breed that have passed an evaluation criteria. In brief, right, we have these large programs, they need to be flexible enough to address the technical dynamism that we're seeing in the market today. And yet, interestingly, on the other end of the spectrum, there are a wide variety of R&D programs and research initiatives, both in the public and private sectors, right, that are already developing the next wave of technologies that would fundamentally disrupt the very architecture we're trying to build now. Right? So as we talk about ML operations at scale and making them more efficient, we also have research that's saying, well, what if we built a large language model that disrupted the need for some of this complex ML ops that we're trying to deploy in the first place? This is, to quote the NSCI, this is uncharted territory for us. And so we actually have a dual problem, right, in the acquisition world of trying to deploy what we can now and making it efficient. And a lot of the companies here are helping do that. Then simultaneously figuring out what's already coming next, because the chain of innovation occurs much faster, right, than perhaps past technologies worked with. Second is, and this is something we've already heard today, so I'll keep my comments brief here, is just increased market access and transparency. I've worked with a lot of AI startups and entrepreneurs over the years, and a lot are interested, right, in pursuing dual use businesses, even if they're not fully aware of what it takes. And there have been a lot of innovations on the acquisition front for rapid procurement. We've already heard about some of them today. But then we hit the inevitable what's next question when those programs reach their life cycle, or the companies, as all companies do, they want to grow. And they ask questions like, well, what's the total addressable market, right, for SaaS products inside, an agency? I don't know about you, but I don't know how one would carve out, a cost estimate from a large multi-year contract that includes everything from help desk support to advanced application development. So if we're going to be bringing these companies in as these different innovation techniques or acquisition vehicles have been doing, it then merits to say, well, what comes next? Well, how do we help these companies think through what it means to build a sustainable business inside of our DoD and defense community? And last but not least, this is a term of art from the venture side, but keep things founder friendly. There was mentioned a question, I believe, on the previous panel about access to data, right? And it is true that there are lots of open source data programs increasingly that are hosted by a variety of the cloud service providers that can serve as a launching off point for companies. But as it's been said, both at this hearing as well as many others, so much of AI is still based on specific use cases. And I've run P&L for these programs, and I can tell you many a times, we say we have a cool prototype. Does it apply to the specific use case I'm trying to do? And until you do that, you're not going to build trust with the end users that we have. And so while I'm not certainly advocating for open sourcing labeled data from special government use cases, there are perhaps other techniques that we can use, such as like trusted boundaries, where we can provide more exposure to companies that want to learn more about government applications, or doing different types of blind evaluation tests, right, to serve as a gating function for companies. We have these tools and expertise, and it serves as another way to not only attract more companies that hopefully will want to come in and support both commercial and government use cases, but also keep them there. So with that, I'd like to thank the opportunity to speak today and look forward to questions.
Thanks very much. Finally, on this panel, we'll hear from Mark Elsey, who is Regional Vice President at DataIQ.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the commission for the opportunity. I feel like it's my job to summarize everything from the day, and I think I might have actually accomplished some of that. I run the federal business at DataIQ, but I think some of my comments will really kind of apply to private industry as well. At DataIQ, we have an end-to-end software platform for developing all sorts of AI, from data ingestion all the way through governance and end-of-lifing a data product. The insights here we've gained from advising over 500 clients around the world, supplying with them the tools to build and scale responsible AI. At DataIQ, we see a future that we call everyday AI, where everyone across government agencies, civilian industry, and job functions has the tools and training to contribute to artificial intelligence in a way that improves everyday life, from decision-making, as well as enabling game-changing products and services that we hear about. But we believe that the future of AI will require all of us and not just some of us. In the context of national security, we've heard about safeguarding IP, cyber threats, supply chain security, all of which are critical issues. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, I'd ask you to consider some foundational challenges that, if not addressed, could prevent us from leading in AI and making us safer. The overriding challenges from our perspective is readiness. At DataIQ, we're focused on three foundational issues when it comes to readiness. The first and most important factor is our people. Within the government and private industry, we simply don't have enough skilled data scientists, data experts, and we lack a coherent, broad-based plan to upskill the workforce that we do have. It's critically important. Second factor is trustworthiness of the AI predictions. Of paramount importance in trustworthiness is transparency. Transparency of the data used, the predictive models developed, as well as continuous, always-on monitoring of models for changes in accuracy and bias. And then the third factor is speed, or what we call speed of mission. Quite simply, we must go faster in industry, with federal agencies, and as a nation. As we've heard, the number of AI patents filed worldwide is growing at an annual rate of 77%. Last year, China filed 3 times more patents than we did. Throwing more money and people at the problem is insufficient. We need an industrial scale production model for AI, analogous to what Henry Ford did for automobiles. Such a model would enable automation, collaboration, and continuous improvement. Now I'll get into a little more detail on each of these. First, on upskilling. We can't hire or outsource our way out of this problem. Some report that the demand for AI experts is 3 to 5 times the supply. And with that kind of a labor environment, federal agencies will have a difficult time competing with Google and Facebook for the number of workers that we need. MITRE estimates that 20% of DoD's civilian workforce could be enabled with some degree of AI skills, which would add approximately 157,000 people to that skilled workforce. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to turn every Excel and PowerPoint user into a coder. We need broad adoption of low code and no code capabilities as a way to get more domain experts involved. For anyone that might not know, and I hope I don't insult anybody, low code and no code refers to software development functions that often require just the click of a mouse versus actually writing software code. With these kinds of tools, it's possible to have a business expert with context working side by side with a PhD data scientist on the same project. Other non-coder roles are required, like data domain experts, data engineers and stewards, model catalog managers, AI operations architects, just to name a few. We know that upskilling works because we have experience at DataIQ with massive upskilling programs at companies like Pfizer and General Electric and Schlumberger. Some best practices in upskilling include branding and publicizing the program within your company, providing multiple self-service learning paths for your employees, and creating multiple levels of certification so that everybody can get started immediately without regard to their current skill level. Upskilling hundreds of thousands of workers that we currently have on the job would create a flywheel effect, both within the federal government and national security infrastructure, as well as across the economy in general. Now, next is trustworthiness. This issue has multiple layers and everybody is very concerned about this. When it comes to readiness, it's critical that the frontline workers have trust in the AI products or they won't use them. Without trust, even the best AI products can't generate value. For example, let's say that an AI model predicts that we have sufficient spare parts on hand to service mission critical aircraft for the next 12 months. If the sailor or airman who's in charge of the depot doesn't trust that insight, they'll overstock and we miss an opportunity for efficiency. Boston Consulting Group estimates that less than 20% of Global 2000 companies have generated significant positive ROI from AI. And the primary reason is lack of trust of the insights. So what do we do about this? Transparency, traceability, and monitoring will help generate that trust. The transparency in the data features that the model uses to make predictions, and an explanation of each individual prediction if needed, if asked for. For example, if a satellite image processing application estimates that a certain factory is operating at only 20% capacity, it should be able to explain how it came through that conclusion. Auditability, traceability of every step that they went through is a way to do that. The third factor is speed or speed of mission, as I said before. Speed comes from involving more people in the process, collaborating in real time, and employing reuse and continuous improvement at every stage. 50 years ago, when software engineering was first being developed as its own discipline, separate from coding, Brooks's law was observed. It said that adding more people to a late software project just makes it later. There were no economies of scale because software was mainly developed by artisanal experts, highly skilled individuals, often working alone or in small groups. Artificial intelligence today is mostly developed like this. Artisanal gurus that do not scale. So we're going to go faster. We have to take some of these learnings and put them into practice. It's time that we apply what we've learned over the last 50 years about software development to AI and create industrial scale processes that include data and model catalogs, data and model operations, interdisciplinary teams collaborating together, and that continuous improvement and continuous integration that I mentioned. So in conclusion, I know everybody wants to get out of here. The reality is that everyday AI is just around the corner, closer. To meet the moment, we need to address and strengthen these fundamental building blocks of readiness by not focusing just on the moonshot items like self-driving cars and things like that, but upskilling our current workforce, developing transparent processes, and industrializing AI development for scale and speed. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Great panel. We've got time because everyone was so great at your comments on time. We've got time for questions. Yeah. Have all the commissioners had a chance to ask a question today? I think so.
Yeah, he's one.
All right, now it's a free for all. You're going to have at it.
I have a quick comment to the data question. So I didn't really hear a lot of great answers from the last panel. So the bottom line is the government is going to advantage itself and retain its data because it has to. Because if I give it to Primer, Sean's going to sell it back to a different part of the government, right? So the right answer there is twofold. One, create an environment where we can bring companies like us to the data, enclave it off, to do your work, protect your IP. And so the DoD is like trying to do that, but what I just said to you is like foreign to them. The other is synthetic data, right? So I can generate the exact same data sets with synthetically so we restrict time and location along the classified aspects. And then you can make that available as well, especially when it comes to like SAP data sets or SCI data sets where maybe we don't have a facility clearance, so I don't have engineers who can see that anyway, even if I could come to the data. I don't know about Sean's crew, but that's where we're at right now.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
No, I wanted to comment on that too, if I could. I remembered that. We work in government and commercial, and the rules apply the same if you're building collaboration and transparency in the development of the AI. So, at Pfizer, they've got these interdisciplinary teams, hundreds, thousands of people working on the same project if need be, and they can see everything that's happening all along the way, even if you're not a technical person. The same works in the Air Force. You create that team, even if it's an enclave. the same principles apply. In that group, we need transparency of how everything's doing and rules that can be enforced through governance and whatever. So it's similar, even though it might be a separate enclave.
Chris has no questions.
Yeah, I had a question on something we've kind of come around a few times today, which is the role of open source software and algorithms in particular, and kind of whether, we had a prior panel, for example, on IP law, and one of the kind of reasons for IP is actually to incentivize disclosure, right, and to make kind of breakthroughs public. What's interesting about AI is that, like, the leading firms are by and large kind of open sourcing both their algorithms and increasingly for some of the larger foundation models, like the model itself. And I'm wondering, there's obviously some real coordination benefits and kind of benefits for innovation, but there's also this issue that, Sean, you mentioned just, you kind of walked through the competitiveness of the US versus China on some key dimensions, including algorithms. And one of the, questions I would have, I guess, is, do you see it as a sustainable kind of ecosystem where, researchers in the US and to some extent China are kind of open sourcing their models? Or do you see that kind of driving nature of AI development changing over time and becoming a little bit more closed off and proprietary, in which case we might need to kind of develop better IP protections and things like that?
Yeah, look, two things on that. One is we already see what we call these kind of dark curves. You see technology development in China, you track the different kind of things, and it goes dark, right? It's like they didn't stop doing it, right?
Right.
Like just went dark. So that's one, right? So as you look through that, not everything is obviously in the open. Secondly, you can read the archive preprints on artificial intelligence. We see them when they come, but we know people in the industry, as he alluded to, that are ahead of that space already and aren't opening all that stuff up. So there's bits of that. The third bit here is these open source models are great if you want to recommend some clothes. But do you know where the open source model came from if you're using this to target computer vision? Now, one of the things on that is you can inject attacks into this. These things are incredibly sensitive to different adversarial attacks, injecting noise. It turns a bus into a stop sign, it turns a stop sign into a cheetah. You can make these things do whatever you want. There's a large scale language model that the Russians just produced. Do you want to use that?
Why not?
Some of it, though, is a product of what particular type of question you're going to answer, right? And so for a lot of cases, like if you're seeing a highly performant open source model, but you may want to tune that for whatever the particular use cases you're dealing with. We've seen this time and time again, and that one could argue the actual tuning part, the application, the integration into a workflow. So in this case, talked about, detecting things on satellite imagery, cradle to grave, and then understanding a feedback loop of analysts clicking to say this is correct, and then that reintegrates into, whatever your retraining cycle is. That sort of entire application, right, is the value component, right? And so if you look at, like, is the model the most valuable thing? Maybe in certain cases, yes, but in other cases, it may not be, right? And so in a lot of these cases, like for certain analysts that's like all source, they may say, I just want good enough, right? Like, I don't need this to be the best thing ever, especially if my budget for running these types of computational resources is N, I have to keep it within that, right? So they just maybe want to accelerate their workflow. So much of this still comes down in many cases to what use case or cases are you trying to address to where you need to go to the next level on whether it's a custom model architecture or something very computationally intensive.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for your testimony today. We've had two excellent panels on national security, but it's mostly been about how we make sure we have the right capacity to achieve our national security goals using algorithmic systems. The flip side of this debate is the proposals by some to restrict these systems. And you hear a lot today about so-called existential risk, global catastrophic risks associated with lethal autonomous weapon systems, so-called killer robots. We haven't heard much discussion about what our government's policy should be towards these things. A couple years back, I was asked to sign a campaign to stop killer robots petition. And I said no, because I said anything that the Russians and Chinese won't sign on to, I don't think America should either. It basically was asking us to preemptively tie our hands on a lot of these autonomous systems and deploying them. So there's many different components to this debate, including export controls and other types of treaties we might enter into. Does anyone on this or previous panel have any comment?
No, the actual DoD policy for lethal autonomous weapons systems. Have you ever read it?
I've read some of what the DoD has published on this front.
Well, it's 3000.09. It's a DoD regulation. You can pull it off the internet. So we absolutely, we in America, you and I have a policy for this.
Yeah.
It's undergoing revision right now. And it's like Forwards, I think, leads the effort in OSC policy, emerging technologies. It was said earlier, Brian said, hey, I hope we never have a human out of the loop. Like, it's actually not the policy, right? The policy is not that. The policy is we will make lethal autonomous weapon systems. There's a board you have to go through before you start development. There's a board that you go through before you deploy the system. But the bottom line is an autonomous weapon system is just like any other weapon system. I've employed many weapon systems, right? It's up to the commander to understand his rules of engagement and make a risk assessment on employing that system, just like any other weapon system. The big difference is the test and evaluation that the department needs to do on these weapon systems, and it ain't even close to being there yet. It's not even close. And a lot of it's outsourced to the developer. It's Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon that's making the system. And they're incentivized to just make a crap test evaluation framework so that the thing goes out there. And I can tell you all about certain ones that are already kind of in development that don't work. It's mostly because the T&E framework is not good.
You look, and I think if we give the situation in Ukraine another 6 months, we'll have a lot of that answered for us. It's very clear that there are advantages by deploying human out of the loop systems, and we're going to see that experiment. We are seeing that experiment run today. I think the issue here, though, on that is the lack of clarity around that. Killer robots. Space, I think, has hindered the ability to actually work on these problems, and the social license to operate for tech companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, to go and work on these spaces, I think, always renders itself as an ethical dilemma. When the fact is the institutions here that are in this country have made very clear decisions around it. They're just not very well known, I think, to the general population.
Just change the topic just a little bit. You talked about workforce. I hear the question about ground truth labeling being a big issue. Because as more AI systems come through, you just need to know what's true, what's wrong. What is your suggestion from a policy perspective in handling the workforce requirements for ground truth labeling?
Well, increasingly, we're going to have to take it in-house to defense because as the models become more sophisticated, the labels need to become more sophisticated. The issue on this is not often ground truth from an individual, but ground truth across teams. And so teams can look at information and say that this is a missile launcher or that's not a missile launcher. So the agreement that they have is really important because the model can only be as good as the agreement of the people labeling it. So that stuff is going to have to come internal. We're not going to be able to mechanical Turk our way through this. We don't want people doing recaptures to kind of get into their email to say whether or not that's a target we want to hit. This is obviously going to be subject matter experts. So that means we need to build that labeling capacity, but it's not a one and done. Right, as soon as the war starts, if I've got a model that identifies Russian tanks and I didn't update that to put big Z's on the side of it, my model's not going to be as good. So the models have to develop, and that actually brings in this human in the loop is actually very much the loop. But you're training the models in real time as the opponent tries to adversarially avoid detection. So this is the workflows we need to start making and bringing. But it's only one piece of the labeling, the training, and the deployment. That the other final bit here is you've got a model. It's great. It takes 6 months to train. Absolutely useless if your opponent fires a hole in it. You say, what's the war, and come back in 6 months when my model's ready.
So
We got time for one more. Jerry,
semi-autonomous tactical weapons, we can live with that. Okay, that's not going to kill the world. But autonomous nuclear weaponry, we know it's public source that there are several times when nations thought that they were being attacked with nuclear weapons. And luckily, there were people that said, hold on a minute, we're not going to fire back. And they literally saved the world on our side and Russia's side. If we put AI, and those go back in time. But now we're in a different environment where we have AI, we may have hypersonic, we may have a very, very closing window of reaction time So we may end up having to put more trust on the system. How should we be thinking about that, for the next decade? Not just for our country, but on an international perspective. How do we build this fail safes that inevitably will be important?
Well, look, I think it's actually the most important question here that we have to actually answer on this is going to be right in front of us with hypersonics. So speed of human cognition is going to render that loop of a human decision of any kind of substance can be very, very difficult, right? So you're going to have to start instrumenting automated responses once hypersonics are there if you want first strike capabilities, which is a fundamental tenet of the current geopolitical structure that we're in. So if we maintain first strike capabilities, we're going to have to think very closely about automation with hypersonics. So that's at the one end of that. On the other end of this, how do you maintain autonomous image recognition, to identify an enemy vehicle, ensure it's not a school? That's a different side of that problem. And I think we need to kind of look at, I think the problems that we can solve, along that spectrum, right? And so nuclear at one end and kind of image recognition for autonomous drones at the other. Where does this come? One thing we do know is that, automation of anything will lead to improvements, but occasionally leads to catastrophic collapses. And you only need to go as far as the financial markets and high frequency trading in the early 2010s to see flash crashes that we don't really understand why they happen, but $1 trillion of market cap is removed for no apparent reason. So we know when you put algorithms together, behaviors that don't make sense to us as humans unfold, and we can't really predict them very well. Right. So this is a space that we're in. Automation will happen in a competitive environment. When it comes together, there's going to be failure modes that we're not really aware of. And finally, you've got a spectrum of, computer vision all the way through to nuclear responses. So it's a space that we have to confront and deal with. But I'll say it's also one that's going to be fraught with a lot of difficulties. So I don't know if we have the answers today, but one thing I will say is we do need to simulate these behaviors a lot more than we're currently doing.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that if I could. At Data IQ, we have this notion of this natural tension in data science, between the mundane stuff you got to do and the moonshot stuff that you want to do. Right? You got really creative together with the mundane and boring. And the boring can be, how do I get my data and wrangle it down and wrestle it to the ground so I can actually use it? And then how do I build algorithms and train against the right data and all that stuff? I think the policymakers are going to decide what we do and how we fight wars and all that stuff. But we have to equip the operators with the training and the tools to know that this is how you build responsible AI. These are the processes that you have in place and the checks and balances, and we're going to continuously monitor it so that nobody's put in that position either where they're missed something and something bad happens, or somebody can do something that nobody knows about. You have that transparency, you have that continuous monitoring, and it's out there. We're doing that today with really big companies, and the operators are buying into it because the people that are doing this want to do responsible AI. They just want to know how to do it.
That's going to be the last word on this panel. Great panel. Thank you all for your time and your expertise and your work. We're certainly going to benefit from your insights. So thank you for that. We are going to take a 5-minute break. We have a fireside chat coming up with Miriam Vogel, but we'll come back in 5 minutes. 5-minute break. So this is the close of our 5th hearing of this commission. We've never had a fireside chat before. So here we are. This is a special treat with a special guest. My fireside doesn't look much like this, but we get the picture, right? We're just going to have a little conversation, and I'll kick it off with a couple of questions, but it's most interesting part of these hearings is always when the commissioners get into it. So they're expert in so many of these areas and always have fabulous insights. But Miriam Vogel is currently the president and CEO of Equal AI, which is a nonprofit launched by Arianna Huffington and Robert Locascio and others to reduce unconscious bias in artificial intelligence and to promote responsible AI governance. She also serves as the chair of the recently launched National AI Advisory Committee mandated by Congress to advise the President and the White House on AI policy. She has been a trusted advisor to high-level federal government officials and business executives for her insights and experience in the responsible development of emerging technology. She also co-hosts a podcast, In AI We Trust, with Kay Firth Butterfield of the World Economic Forum. Miriam, thanks for being here, first of all.
My honor, thank you.
Delighted you're here. First, can you tell us a little bit about Equal AI? What are you doing and what are you trying to accomplish there?
Thank you for asking and thank you for having me here. Truly, I'm so grateful you're doing this work and to be able to speak with you. So in Equal AI, our focus is, as you said, reducing bias in AI, reducing risks and vulnerabilities, improving AI governance, making AI governance more translatable. We see AI as the new cyber threat that people don't yet realize. And by the time they see the landscape, they see the risks, it will be too late. And so we try to really help get people ready for AI by focusing on three main constituencies. We work with policymakers, so with NIST, with different US agencies and abroad. We work with lawyers, and that's my own bias as a lawyer, that lawyers are the partner to companies in identifying risks, liabilities, harms, and lawyers need to be doing more here to ensure that we have frameworks and safeguards in place so that companies are on the right path. And the third area where we spend most of our time is with companies. So for instance, we have a pledge that we have for companies to take to help them understand how they can reduce their liabilities and discrimination and other risks by pledging to reduce bias in AI. We have a badge program for senior executives because once they understand the risks, they want to understand what to do. And it's very hard right now because we don't have national or international consensus on best practices. We do a lot of work with boards because, like in cyber and other areas, I think ultimately they will have some of this fiduciary responsibility and other liabilities, and they can play a key role in ensuring the C-suite is ready for AI.
Sure. So on top of your day job at Equal AI, as you've just described, you are also serving our country, thank you, in your capacity as a co-chair of the National AI Advisory Committee. Tell us a little bit about that. And I know what it's like to be a co-chair of this commission. Tell us about what it's like to be a co-chair of that committee.
Well, it is a true honor, and it's exciting because I think right now our leadership in this country is taking shape in terms of AI. And I am fortunate to be one of 27 who have been selected to help us drive forward on policy recommendations to the president, to the White House, as mandated by Congress. And so hopefully with congressional support and input so that we can create action. Our goal is impact. There are so many great studies and resources. You will have the report that you all are creating. We have so many reports out there by the top experts. Our goal is let's drive this to action and soon.
Yeah. So we're seeing a lot of things happening internationally. We've spent a good bit of time with our, at least last couple of panels today, talking about national security, what's going on internationally. There are countries whose values and agendas don't necessarily align with ours in the United States that are collaborating. You have other folks who are looking to regulate AI. It all impacts us in one in a some way, shape, or form. What's the U.S. role? What is our competitive advantage here? We've heard a lot about that in our previous hearings. The U.S. can be a leader if we decide to lead. What are our competitive advantages when it comes to artificial intelligence, and what ought we to be doing?
I would argue that it's not that we need to be a leader, it's that we need to maintain our leadership because our brand is trust. I think what we have that some of our competitors don't is faith that our AI does what it says it's going to do, that it's effective, that it's inclusive. And I think right now we have this opportunity at this critical juncture when AI is becoming such a fluid part of our daily life and is part of our key functions. It's very rare to talk to a company these days that's not using AI in pivotal functions, and they often don't know it. So we have this opportunity for a reckoning in companies to understand the power at their fingertips to have scaled impact that can improve their functions. They can do HR functions better. They can do financial determinations better if they embed our values within their AI systems.
Right. So, go ahead, please.
To clarify on values, I mean it in a broad term that whereas in other countries where the focus is purely on data retention, we have a focus as well on being inclusive. And I think that is also a competitive advantage because the more people who are included in the framework of our AI creation, the more people who can benefit from our AI.
So part of our work on this commission is to look at AI governance. What would effective regulation look like? What would responsible regulation look like? What would reasonable regulation look like in the area of AI as is impacted by government policy? I mean, ideally, we would provide some guardrails. You used trust as our brand. Like, how do we safeguard and build that public trust in AI and prevent harm, right? Societal harm? What recommendations might you have for us? And I know it's a big question, but maybe just off the top of your head.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The way I think of this is that we are on this high speeds freeway right now, but we don't have lanes. We don't have speed regulations, and we don't even have mandates as to who is allowed to travel on this road.
Right.
So I think first and foremost, it's clarifying what we intend for the road, the basic structures, the lines to look like. I mean, we know in a new city, building a safe road is a whole different story than going to the old streets in Italy and trying to build backwards. It's just almost impossible at some point. So I think first thing we can do is move quickly. So I'm glad that this report is coming out in the near term and that others are moving quickly because we don't have 5 years to set the rules of the road. AI is being deployed at scale today. And the more that we wait, the harder it will be, if not impossible in some cases, to unpack what it is that we expect of companies. And I think some of it is just basic expectations, which many companies are now taking on their own, but we have to make consistency so that customers know what to expect, government knows how to understand what's happening, and that companies can ensure that what they're doing puts them in the best place 5-10 years down the road, that they are in compliance and that they're doing what is expected of them. So for instance, routine testing. Most companies that are savvy to the risks of AI are doing this in some way right now, but it's not being done with consistent expectations. How often are you testing? Now that'll depend on what kind of AI systems you're creating, but it needs to be routine. AI iterates, your testing has to be consistent as well. And you'll want to document what it is that you're testing so that down the road, people within your company know what has been tested and when, what hasn't. And as we know, AI is moving across borders, across companies. People who are creating the AI are also the final users. So we want that consistency. So at the end of the day, when people maintain their testing, they know what has and hasn't been tested and what to look for.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the report. We are about to get into maybe our hardest work is actually drafting our report. These commissioners are all going to be honing in and specializing in different areas, sections of this report. And I know they have questions and I know they will want to benefit from your expertise. Rachel, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I have so many questions. Thank you for being here. I'll start with kind of the high level, but one, and I wish it wasn't attention, but I think it sort of is attention. We're looking at innovation, competition, and then, but of course, responsibility and equality and really holding on to our values in that. Can you say anything about how you're approaching that tension as you're considering regulatory recommendations or how you think about that tension in this space?
Yeah, and to be clear, I can't talk about recommendations for NIAC because we are not yet there. For NIAC, we are still in the briefing stage. We will hope to get to recommendations in the spring, late spring of next year, but we're still early stages. I can tell you from my perspective, it's a healthy tension, but again, goes to our brand, our trust. I think that first of all, we don't have, as we know, enough workforce to produce the AI that we need if we don't make sure that we have a broader cross-section of our population creating the AI. On the flip side, once we do find ways to get more women, more people of color participating in the AI ecosystem, and I don't mean just coders. I mean, I think one thing that we need to do is define what will the AI economy look like? What is that ecosystem? It's a broad ecosystem of managers, of supporters, of, there's going to be tons of new jobs and some of them similar to ours and different. I think we need to define that so that we can make sure that we have that workforce in place. I think we need to make sure that it's a broad cross-section, both because we need all hands on deck so that we can compete, but also all the evidence shows that AI is better when you have a broad cross-section creating the AI. In our experience, our operating thesis is that bias and risks embed at each human touch point along the AI lifecycle. And so you need to make sure that in each of those touch points, you have people who can help ask the questions, help think outside of their own imagination, which you can only do with your lived experience. So the more perspectives, geography, age, race, nationality you can bring to those different touch points from its creation, development, to testing at the end, I think that's a real opportunity. Testing, what have we missed along the way? And we'll need to keep testing and it keeps iterating. So it's a long answer to the fact that that it requires some investment and thought now, but I think that's our path to win.
Can rotate around a little, Conrad? Question?
Sure. So from the hardware side, we're already seeing disproportionate allocation of access to hardware. Some of these models take weeks, millions of dollars to train. What are your recommendations or thoughts around leveling the playing field for startups to have access to these training, not only the models themselves, but just the ability to train these algorithms?
Such a great question. Access to the data sets is another piece of that with significant costs and reduced access. I do think that's a place for government to play a role. I do think that, when you're talking about leveling the playing field, creating incentives, creating more data sets, first of all, I think that's a way ensuring that you have anonymized data sets that are useful. And whether it's healthcare, population data of other sets, I think that is a role for government to provide and serve. But I'm glad you're thinking about it, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking about too, because I think you're absolutely spot on that that's a tension.
There's question.
Something from you?
Yeah, sorry, Checker. Go ahead.
Great. My mind is stuck on the data aspect.
Yeah.
In my mind, AI is a lot of fuzzy thing. It's really data that drives insights. It's like a big hammer on data. That's it. If you have the data, then you can drive a lot of value. If you look at a country, right, we have land and the rules to make sure land is governed and is not hoarded by a couple of people, few people. When you go to data, you will see that the data that's driving value for the country is kind of controlled in specific worlds. Some corporations drive up data in one area versus the other. As we heard testimonies for the last several months, one of the key things is how do you really give this data or have policies to make this data available for more innovation? Otherwise, we're not able to deploy it. Even if you create a lot of workforce, unless you make this data both what exists, what is getting created in a manner that's controlled, protected, made available the right way, there's no way you can drive a lot of innovation. I was just curious if this is something that has come up in your thought process. How are you thinking about having this?
Yeah, I think that's a key element. We need to train on data that we trust, as well as that is large enough, as well as that many people have access to, but yet can't corrupt it. With sharing it, you also bring on different risks. So yes, this is something we think a lot about. I should mention, in case it's useful, the way that we plan to proceed with 27 members is we've divided our work into 5 working groups, plus there's a subcommittee created by Congress. Or we've been mandated to launch. So we are soon going to launch a law enforcement subcommittee. That's a separate track. Within our 27 members, we have trustworthy AI, and that certainly comes up. We have research and development, where both of these pieces are key discussions. We have competitiveness, and that's where we think about our government's preparedness to ensure our leadership. We have workforce, no common great interest, and then international collaboration. So on several, it's interesting to try and divide it up even because there's so much overlap. Each of those are served by data, and each of those are served by trustworthy AI. The other piece that we decided on in our first meeting was that, first of all, in addition to our recommendations to the president and the White House, we would use the mandate of being a public commission to amplify the AI discussion. So trying to engage a broader cross-section into the conversation, making sure that our panels include new voices and trying to think critically about how to engage more of the population in this conversation. The other piece that we all agreed to is that while trustworthy AI is one working group, that's in every work stream, that if AI is not reliable, trustworthy, and inclusive, that it's not on brand, which is not how we define it there, but for our conversation today. Yes, something we give great thought to.
All right, one more question, Chris? Yeah, well, as the Congress mentioned, this is kind of the last of 5 hearings, and I think one of the tensions that's become apparent in all of them is this balance of how much of responsible AI or equitable AI really should be the result of kind of self-regulatory efforts or kind of principled commitments that private firms make, those who are developing the AI, and how much of it really should be regulation and kind of policies mandated by government. And I think given the kind of unique perch you've had where you've worked both with companies and also the government, I'd just be curious to hear how you think about navigating that balance.
So I do think at the end of the day, the reason we spend so much of our time working with companies and executives is because this will be within the company's purview. If they are committed to this, I believe they'll benefit from a competitive advantage. But at the end of the day, a company that is committed to this is the only real way to achieve trustworthy AI in the deepest sense. They have the ultimate purview. They have the decision of how much investment and credibility they want in this realm. That said, I think big picture, there is some need for the traffic lanes. There's some need to establish what are the basic if there's no other practical reason, then the litigation and the regulation will be coming, whether it's from the US or elsewhere. We know that it's coming. We know the litigation is going to be coming. The lawyers, as soon as they're clued into the fact that there are scaled harms and discrimination based on laws currently on the books, let alone what's to come, and that it happens to often come from the deep pockets, this will be a cottage industry. And so I think the more we can do now to help companies understand our expectations and what basic compliance looks like, the better served they are.
Miriam, we wish you the very best. We really thank you for spending some time with us here today, and you have really important work ahead of you, and as do we. So I'll just close out our last hearing today. We want to thank everybody at the Chamber for all the incredible work you guys, Jordan, Michael, you guys and your team do to make all this come together. You kind of brought us all together, convened us. It's been awesome. What an incredible group of people. Thanks to these commissioners. Really appreciate your dedication and just the vast brain power that you bring to this. My kids like to say, some people have really big brains. We have a group of commissioners who have really big brains, and it's been fantastic to benefit from that. And now, as I mentioned, maybe our hardest work is going to is beginning to synthesize, summarize, and come up with some recommendations. So I look forward to that, and I appreciate your willingness to continue down this path. Thanks for all of that work, and we're looking forward to hopefully doing some good for our country and the world, as you are in your work. So we're going to try to do that on this commission as well. So thanks, everybody. This concludes our 5th hearing. I wish I had a gavel. I would gavel. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.